History has a strange way of never quite ending when we think it should. In 1945, the guns of the Second World War went silent, yet the peace that followed was uneasy, like a calm sea that still remembers the storm. The victors stood shoulder to shoulder in triumph, but their smiles hid a question that neither dared to ask aloud: what happens now, when there's no common enemy left to fight? The answer came not with bombs, but with boundaries, lines on maps, walls of ideology, and a deep, restless mistrust. The United States looked to the future through the lens of liberty and free enterprise. Across the ruins of Europe, the Soviet Union dreamed of a world remade in the image of socialism, disciplined and unyielding. Both believed they carried the promise of a better world, and both feared what would happen if the other succeeded. So began a contest unlike any before it. A war without battlefields. A rivalry fought in the skies above Berlin, in the deserts of the Middle East, in the jungles of Asia, and in the quiet hum of laboratories buried beneath concrete. It was a war of words, of wits, and of waiting, a test of endurance played out across half a century. For Americans, it was a time of pride and anxiety, of moon landings and fallout shelters, of presidents and spies, of music that dared to hope and walls that refused to fall. For Russians, it was a struggle for respect, for survival, for an ideal that demanded sacrifice and secrecy in equal measure. Between them, the world became a chessboard, and every nation a square to be won or lost. Tonight, we will drift through those years not through noise and fear, but through memory. From Truman to Reagan, from the Berlin blockade to the fall of the wall, from the fire of the atomic age to the quiet collapse of an empire. This is the story of how peace learned to live with tension, how victory cast a shadow that lasted generations, and how, beneath that shadow, the world learned to sleep with one eye open. After the guns fell silent, 1945, 1947, when the last gun fell silent in 1945, the world exhaled for the first time in 6 long years. But peace, as it turned out, did not mean quiet. The ruins of Europe still smoked, the ashes of Hiroshima still glowed faintly beneath the dust, and across oceans, nations looked at one another, not as brothers in arms, but as strangers suddenly left alone in a dimly lit room. The war had ended, but its shadow had only begun to stretch. The United States emerged from the wreckage untouched by the bombs that had gutted London or the artillery that had flattened Warsaw. Its industries had fed the war machine of the Allies and now found themselves humming with unrivaled energy. Workers who had built tanks now built cars. Soldiers returned home to families who dreamed of new beginnings in suburban houses with tidy lawns. In diners and small towns, optimism filled the air like the smell of coffee and gasoline. But beyond those shores, the world was a mosaic of hunger and ruin. In the East, the Soviet Union limped from its victory, bleeding but unbroken. 20 million of its sons and daughters were gone, entire cities razed to their foundations. In that landscape of sorrow, Joseph Stalin saw not tragedy alone, but vulnerability. Twice in a generation, the fires of war had reached Russian soil from Napoleon and from Hitler, and he vowed it would never happen again. In Washington, President Harry Truman inherited a world that no longer fit the old maps. He was a man of Missouri plainness, suddenly handed the keys to an empire of responsibility. Franklin Roosevelt had managed the delicate balance of cooperation with Stalin through the war. But Truman, blunt and pragmatic, distrusted the Soviet leader's motives. To him, Stalin's tightening grip over Eastern Europe was not security, it was conquest. Yet to Stalin, America's confident call for democracy and open markets was not generosity, it was encirclement in disguise. So, while the rubble was still being cleared from the streets of Berlin, the victors began to eye each other warily. In those early post-war years, suspicion was the new fog that drifted over the continent. It rolled across conferences in Yalta and Potsdam, seeped through diplomatic telegrams, and whispered through the new corridors of the United Nations building, where diplomats spoke of peace but already rehearsed the language of rivalry. Europe itself seemed caught between two magnets pulling in opposite directions. In the West, France, Britain, and the newly re-energized United States dreamed of rebuilding through open trade and recovery funds. In the East, Soviet armies lingered in the lands they had liberated, and local communist parties rose swiftly to prominence. To the people of Poland, Hungary, and Romania, liberation began to look more like occupation. Elections, where they occurred, were managed. Dissent, where it stirred, was swiftly silenced. Stalin moved deliberately, piece by piece, securing what he called a buffer zone against the West. He saw it as survival. Washington saw it as expansion. Meanwhile, in the United States, the glow of victory coexisted uneasily with the chill of responsibility. Americans had never wanted to rule the world, but after 1945, it seemed the world waited for their lead. The atomic bomb, whose blinding light had ended the war, hung over the globe as both symbol and warning. Truman knew that America possessed a power beyond imagination, but he also knew such power made others tremble. When Soviet scientists began their own race toward nuclear mastery, the notion of peace took on a new, fragile meaning: peace, not by trust, but by terror of what war could now bring. The first signs of the coming divide appeared quietly in speeches and telegrams. In early 1946, Winston Churchill traveled to the United States and stood before an audience in Missouri beside Truman. The war hero spoke in solemn tones. "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic," he said, "an iron curtain has descended across the continent." The phrase struck like a bell, tolling across capitals from London to Moscow. To many Americans, it was the moment the Cold War truly began, though no one would have dared call it that yet. Across the Atlantic, life carried on in the ruins. Children played among collapsed buildings. Farmers coaxed crops from poisoned soil. In Berlin, divided into sectors under Allied supervision, the uneasy coexistence of former allies became a daily rehearsal of tension. American and Soviet officers passed one another on the same streets, with polite nods and cold eyes. At first, there were gestures of cooperation, the sharing of rations, the joint oversight of rebuilding, but beneath the surface, every handshake carried the weight of calculation. Each side counted the other's trucks, watched the uniforms, measured the flow of coal and grain. Washington's policymakers began to see Europe not only as a humanitarian concern, but as a battlefield of ideology. Economic collapse, they feared, would breed the very communism Stalin wished to export. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine took shape. The United States would support free peoples resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. The words were diplomatic. The meaning was unmistakable. America would not retreat into isolation again. It would stand wherever freedom was threatened, first in Greece and Turkey, then wherever the dominoes seemed ready to fall. To pay for that stance, Secretary of State George Marshall unveiled what became the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars to rebuild Europe's shattered economies. To a generation weary of rationing and rubble, it was a lifeline. To Moscow, it was a Trojan horse, a means for America to bind Europe to its system of markets and influence. Stalin forbade Eastern Bloc nations from accepting it, insisting instead on their own Soviet-led program of reconstruction. Thus, even before the first shipments of American wheat and steel reached European ports, the continent was divided by invisible walls of policy and pride. For the American public, the Cold War began not with fear, but with confidence. Newsreels showed soldiers returning home, industries booming, and babies born into a future that promised comfort unknown to their parents. Yet beneath that optimism lay an unease that older listeners now remember, the feeling that, somewhere far away, decisions were being made that could end everything in a single flash of light. The atomic age had arrived quietly, but its presence was constant, like the hum of a refrigerator late at night, a reminder that something powerful and unseen was always running in the background. In Moscow, propaganda spoke of capitalist aggression, of Western imperialism dressed in friendly smiles. Soviet citizens rebuilt their cities under portraits of Lenin and Stalin, certain their nation had saved the world from fascism, only to face a new, subtler enemy. Schools taught vigilance, newspapers praised sacrifice, and spies became heroes in novels and whispers alike. In America, too, the culture began to shift. Hollywood turned its lens toward intrigue. Pulp magazines filled with stories of double agents and secret codes. The world had traded the clarity of battle for the uncertainty of suspicion. By 1947, the term Cold War found its way into headlines. It was a strange phrase, war without war, conflict without combat. But those who lived through those early years knew its meaning in their bones. They felt it in the tightening of alliances, in the sudden secrecy of science, in the small but growing distance between words like ally and adversary. They heard it in Truman's measured speeches, in the rhetoric of Soviet broadcasts, in the hush that followed any mention of atomic secrets. In Europe's marketplaces, American dollars began to circulate. In Soviet factories, new machines roared to life under the red banner. Yet for all the rebuilding, trust could not be reconstructed. Each side believed the other sought dominance, and in that mutual belief lay the foundation of decades to come. The Cold War was not born in a single moment. It settled gradually, like frost at dawn, coating everything until even friendship seemed brittle. And yet, within that frost, life continued. Families in the United States moved into neat houses built by the GI Bill. Children watched the skies where once bombers had flown and now dreamed of airplanes carrying mail and passengers instead of bombs. In Moscow, new theaters opened, poets returned from exile, and people spoke quietly of the hope that Stalin's iron grip might one day ease. Humanity, stubborn as it is, went on living, shopping, working, falling in love even as the great powers began to dig trenches of ideology. From the wreckage of the old world, two new giants stood alone, each convinced it was the guardian of humanity's future. One believed in freedom born of choice, the other in equality born of discipline. Both feared that the other's vision, if left unchecked, would swallow the world. So they watched each other, measured each other, and slowly began to build their defenses not against invasion, but against uncertainty itself. By the end of 1947, the air of cooperation that had once lingered after victory was gone. The wartime alliance that defeated Hitler had transformed into a rivalry that would define generations. The soldiers who had fought side by side on the banks of the Elbe now faced one another across diplomatic tables, armed not with rifles, but with words. The guns had indeed fallen silent, but the silence itself had become a weapon. The world, tired of war, had entered a new kind of waiting, one that would stretch for nearly half a century. And somewhere in that stillness, in the soft static between American radio broadcasts and Soviet transmissions, the restand Cold War began to hum its endless lullaby, drawing the line 1947, 1949. There are moments in history when maps stop being about geography and start being about belief. Between 1947 and 1949, the world's lines were redrawn not by armies moving across fields, but by ideas seeping across borders softly, steadily, like ink in water. What began as a difference of vision between two allies became a contest for the soul of the century. The peace that followed World War II had been a fragile one, built on ceremony and exhaustion. But by the late 1942, the tremor beneath it could no longer be ignored. In Washington, policymakers spoke in cautious tones about containment. In Moscow, the word encirclement hissed through party meetings like a curse. Both sides saw themselves as defenders, each certain the other was preparing to strike first. President Truman, who had quietly replaced the charisma of Franklin Roosevelt with a farmer's steadiness, began to sense that the brief goodwill of wartime would not survive the years ahead. He read cables from Europe that spoke of hunger, strikes, and political unrest, Coal shortages shut down factories, entire nations rationed bread. It was not only devastation but despair, and despair, to Washington's eyes, was the perfect soil for communism to grow. From those fears came a new doctrine, shaped in the cautious language of diplomacy but lit with moral fire. In March 1947, Truman stood before Congress and declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The words echoed through marble halls, across radio waves, and into the homes of citizens who still remembered the Great Depression and the long years of war. The Truman Doctrine, as it came to be known, was more than a policy, it was a promise. America, once hesitant to involve itself in the world's quarrels, would now stand as guardian of a doctrine, fragile freedom wherever it flickered. To Greece and Turkey, it meant lifelines of money and aid. To Stalin, it meant encirclement painted as generosity. He saw in it the first formal step toward what he believed was America's hidden empire, one not of colonies, but of influence. Yet in Washington, the decision was born less from ambition than from memory. The ghosts of appeasement still haunted the halls of power. No one wanted to watch another tyranny rise unopposed. As spring turned to summer, another voice joined the chorus of rebuilding. George C. Marshall, the calm, precise former general who now served as Secretary of State, standing at Harvard in June 1947, he spoke of a plan that would soon bear his name. Europe, he said, was not just a collection of damaged nations, it was a body in shock. If its economy failed, its politics would follow. The United States, with its unmatched wealth, could help it heal. The idea was simple and radical. American funds and expertise would pour into Europe to rebuild its factories, restore its farms, and stabilize its currencies. But behind that generosity lay calculation. A prosperous Europe would be a bulwark against communism, a starving one might surrender to it. The Marshall Plan, unveiled with quiet dignity, became one of the grandest acts of peacetime aid in history, and one of the earliest dividing lines of the Cold War. Moscow rejected it immediately. Soviet diplomats called it dollar imperialism, a clever trick to bind Europe to Washington through debt and gratitude. Stalin ordered his allies to refuse participation, even those desperate for help. Czechoslovakia hesitated, tempted by the promise of aid, until Moscow's stern warning arrived. Within weeks, its government fell firmly back into the Soviet camp. The divide was no longer theoretical. It ran through dinner tables and ministries, through fields and factories, through hearts that longed for peace but feared the cost of choosing the wrong side. Across Western Europe, however, the American plan took hold like spring after winter. Cranes rose over shattered harbors, rail lines clattered back to life, and markets began to fill with color again. To ordinary Europeans, the gray monotony of ration books slowly gave way to something that looked like hope. In Washington, charts and graphs showed production climbing, and policymakers spoke with a new confidence that democracy could be defended not just with arms, but with bread. While economists measured recovery, strategists measured danger. In 1948, a crisis erupted that tested every promise of the post-war world, the Berlin blockade. The city of Berlin, carved into 4 occupation zones, lay deep within Soviet-controlled East Germany. For years, it had been a symbol of uneasy cooperation. American, British, French, and Soviet soldiers patrolling different districts, sharing uneasy smiles in cafes, now serving chicory instead of coffee. But as West Germany prepared to unify its western zones under a single economic system, Moscow saw betrayal. To Stalin, a prosperous West Germany meant a dagger pointed at his flank. In June 1948, Soviet troops quietly closed the roads and railways leading into West Berlin. The lifelines that carried food, coal, and medicine to 2 million civilians were cut overnight. No warning, no negotiation, just silence. The city, trapped inside the Soviet zone, became an island in a sea of hostility. For the people of Berlin, hunger returned like an old acquaintance. Street lamps dimmed, ovens went cold, and shelves emptied. Yet the Western powers refused to yield. In a meeting that would later become legend, American and British commanders agreed that if the roads were closed, they would take to the skies. And so began the Berlin airlift, one of the most extraordinary feats of logistics and determination in modern history. Day and night, cargo planes rumbled over rooftops, their engines echoing through fog and snow. Pilots flew, narrow corridors marked by the threat of Soviet interceptors, landing every few minutes at Tempelhof and Gatow airfields. Children pressed their faces to windows, counting planes instead of clouds. They called the pilots Rosenbomber raisin bombers because many dropped small parachutes filled with candy for the waiting kids below. For nearly a year, the airlift sustained an entire city, thousands of flights, millions of tons of supplies. The effort was more than humanitarian, it was symbolic. Every landing was a message that the West would not abandon Berlin, that freedom, once promised, would be delivered even through the sky. When Stalin finally lifted the blockade in May 1949, he gained nothing but embarrassment. The attempt to starve Berlin had instead fed Western unity. Out of that unity came an alliance that would define half a century. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Signed in April 1949, it bound 12 nations together under a simple pledge: an attack on DT9 one would be considered an attack on all. The language was calm, almost bureaucratic, but its meaning was thunderous. For the first time in its history, the United States entered a permanent peacetime military alliance. The oceans that once protected it were no longer barriers. They were bridges to a shared defense. In Moscow, the response was swift, if not immediate. The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe, transforming its occupied territories into a formal bloc of people's democracies. In 1949, it tested its first atomic bomb, ending America's monopoly on nuclear power. The age of mutual fear had officially begun. No longer could one side threaten without expecting annihilation in return. Back in the United States, ordinary citizens followed these events through radio crackle and black-and-white newsreels. They heard of Berlin, of NATO, of the Iron Curtain stretching across Europe. For those who had fought in the recent war, the developments felt both familiar and unsettling. They had beaten fascism only to watch the world divide again. Yet amid that worry was a quiet pride that America, wealthy and confident, stood as the anchor of a shaken world. The late 1940s were years of subtle transformation at home as well. Veterans returned to universities through the GI Bill, suburbs spread across once rural farmland, television flickered into living rooms, bringing news of distant places into domestic calm. Beneath the surface of prosperity, though, a new kind of tension coiled. Newspapers carried stories about Soviet spies, about atomic secrets stolen from laboratories in New Mexico and Canada. In Washington, congressional committees began their hearings on loyalty and subversion. Few realized that the anxiety taking root would one day bloom into the fever of McCarthyism, but its seeds were planted here, in the dawning fear that enemies could hide not only abroad but next door. The world's division was not merely military or political, it was emotional. People on both sides learned to see themselves as defenders of light against shadow. In Soviet schools, children memorized lessons about capitalist greed. In American classrooms, maps showed bright democracies surrounded by ominous red territories. The language of fear became the grammar of everyday life. And yet, for all the propaganda, there were still letters exchanged between scientists, musicians, and journalists who refused to let borders silence curiosity. Cultural ties, fragile as they were, continued to glimmer in orchestra. Invited to tour abroad, a film quietly screened behind closed doors. It was as if the human spirit, stubborn and ungovernable, refused to draw the line quite as neatly as governments did. By the end of 1949, the outlines of the New World were clear. Europe was no longer a single continent, but two visions pressed together back to back. In the West, economies revived under the glow of American aid and the promise of collective security. In the East, reconstruction came through state planning, loyalty to Moscow, and the belief that socialism would outlast capitalism's temptations. Between them stretched borders, patrolled by soldiers who rarely fired their guns but never lowered them. Those who lived through these years would later recall not the thunder of war, but the quiet hum of tension that never stopped. It was in the radio bulletins about new treaties, in the headlines about atomic tests, in the way people hesitated before speaking politics aloud. Peace, they discovered, could be exhausting in its own way, a kind of endless alertness. Still, there was dignity in endurance. Berlin survived, Western Europe rose from its ruins, and the United States, stepping into a role it had not sought, became both protector and participant in a drama that would span generations. The lines drawn between 1947 and 1949 would harden into borders, alliances, and doctrines, but behind those lines lived ordinary people, farmers in Iowa, teachers in Prague, mothers in Warsaw, each dreaming of a normal life beneath the constant murmur of uncertainty. As the decade closed, Truman addressed the nation with the calm assurance of a man who had seen both war and reconstruction. He spoke of vigilance, of cooperation, of faith in democracy's endurance. His voice carried the gravity of history but also its gentleness. For Americans listening by lamplight, it sounded less like alarm and more like reassurance, that whatever this new struggle might bring, they would face it not with panic, but with purpose. Across the Atlantic, in the Kremlin's cold corridors, Stalin reviewed intelligence reports and production charts, measuring every American shipment of aid and every Western meeting as if counting future battles. He believed time was on his side, that discipline and ideology would outlast capitalism's softness. He could not yet know that his empire's greatest challenge would come not from invasion, but from its own weight. For now, though, the lines had been drawn. The war was over, but peace had taken its place like a stranger wearing a familiar coat, recognizable yet uneasy. The world had entered the long twilight between fear and faith, a place where the heart never fully rests. And as night fell over 1949, the map of that twilight was clear for all to see, two halves of one world, staring at each other across a silence that would last for decades. The sky divided, Berlin and the first confrontation, 1948 1949. The heart of Europe beat faintly in those years, weak but steady, surrounded by rubble and watchtowers. Berlin was a city of contradictions, half in light, half in shadow. Its grand boulevards were cracked and dusty, yet cafes served thin coffee to men in worn suits who still tried to talk of art and music. The war was over, but the peace felt unfinished, as if history had paused halfway through a sentence. The victors of that war, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, had agreed to share responsibility for Germany's future. Berlin, the former capital of the Nazi Empire, was divided into 4 zones of occupation, each managed by one of the Allies. It was meant to be temporary, a practical arrangement until the country could be rebuilt. But as 1948 dawned, it became clear that what was temporary might soon turn permanent. In the western half of the city, American and British soldiers lived among the people, helping rebuild schools, distributing rations, and reopening the factories that had survived the bombing. Their tone was firm but friendly. They spoke of democracy, of rebuilding with dignity, of Germany's place in a peaceful Europe. In the Eastern Zone, Soviet administrators moved with quiet efficiency. They organized committees, nationalized industries, and encouraged loyalty to new communist parties. They too spoke of dignity, but of a different kind, one born of discipline, equality, and vigilance. For a while, these two visions existed side by side, awkwardly but without open conflict. The city's trams ran through both halves, carrying workers from one sector to another, In cafes, people from East and West could still sit at the same table and trade cigarettes for stories. But beneath the chatter, tension grew. Every decision, the printing of currency, the flow of coal, the wording of new laws became a quiet contest of influence. Then, in the spring of 1948, that tension burst into the open. The Western powers, determined to revive Germany's economy, announced plans to introduce a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in their zones. It would replace the wartime Reichsmark, whose value had collapsed. To them, it was an economic necessity. To Stalin, it was an act of betrayal. A prosperous, stable West Germany, backed by American aid through the Marshall Plan, would stand as a living argument against Soviet control in the East. It would be proof that capitalism could rise from ruin while socialism remained mired in scarcity. And so, on the night of the 24th of June 1948, the Soviets acted. Without warning, they closed all railways, roads, and canals leading from the western zones into Berlin. Freight trains halted mid-journey, buses turned back at checkpoints, barges sat still in the River Spree. The electricity that powered West Berlin flickered and died, for it came from plants in the east. The blockade had begun. 2 million people, men, women, and children, were trapped. Their city lay 100 miles deep inside Soviet-controlled territory, cut off from food and fuel. Soviet authorities assured them they could receive supplies from the east if they would simply accept the new order. But the West refused to yield. To give in would mean abandoning their principles, and perhaps the entire post-war settlement. In Washington and London, the question hung heavy. Would Berlin be surrendered or saved? Military planners warned that breaking the blockade by force could mean war. No one wanted another conflict so soon after the last. Yet leaving the city to starve would destroy the credibility of everything the United States had promised. It was then that a plan emerged, improbable, desperate, and quietly heroic. If Berlin could not be supplied by land, it would be supplied by air. Every loaf of bread, every sack of coal, every bottle of medicine would be flown in. The idea seemed impossible. The numbers were staggering. But within days, it was underway. The first planes took off from bases in West Germany, C-47 Dakotas and C-54 Skymasters, their bellies packed with supplies. They flew narrow corridors through Soviet-controlled airspace, routes agreed upon years earlier for Allied use. The corridors were barely wide enough for error, and the weather often turned treacherous. But still, the planes came one every few minutes, day and night. At first, the people of Berlin watched from the ruins, silent and uncertain. Then, as days turned into once droopy weeks, hope took shape in the roar of engines. The sky above Tempelhof Airport became a rhythm of arrival and departure, like a heartbeat for the city below. Children began to wait near the runways, waving scraps of paper at the incoming planes. One American pilot, Lieutenant Gail Halverson, began dropping small parachutes filled with candy to the children below. The locals called him Uncle Wackelflugel, Uncle Wiggly Wings, for the way he waggled his plane's wings in greeting. His kindness spread by word of mouth, a tiny act of joy in the midst of hardship. The airlift grew into an extraordinary effort. Pilots from the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and other nations joined the operation. Ground crews worked without rest, unloading flour, coal, and milk powder before the planes could take off again. Each landing took only minutes. The coordination was almost musical in its precision. By winter, planes were arriving every 30 seconds. Soviet forces watched but did not interfere directly. Instead, they tried to intimidate, buzzing the air corridors with fighters, shining searchlights into cockpits, spreading rumors that the planes carried weapons instead of food. But the airlift continued, and every ton of cargo that landed in Berlin weakened the blockade's grip. Winter came, harsh and gray. Coal became as precious as gold. The temperature dropped below freezing, and yet the flights did not stop. Pilots joked that they had become sky truckers, ferrying survival one load at a time. On Christmas Eve, churches rang bells that had been silent for years. They sang hymns by candlelight, their voices drifting up toward the low, endless hum of aircraft. The blockade lasted for nearly 11 months. By its end, more than 2 million tons of supplies had been delivered. The West had accomplished what few thought possible. It had kept a city alive by air alone. On the 12th of May, 1949, Stalin finally gave the order to lift the blockade. The trains began to run again, the canals reopened, and the lights flickered back to life. But the victory was not only logistical, it was moral. The world had seen which side would feed the hungry and which would try to starve them. For the people of Berlin, the airlift became a symbol not only of survival but of belonging. The city that had once been the heart of Hitler's empire was now the front line of freedom. The West had not abandoned them, and that faith would endure through every crisis to come. In the United States, the success of the airlift was greeted with pride and relief. Newspapers hailed it as a triumph of ingenuity and willpower. Photographs of smiling Berlin children waving at cargo planes filled the front pages. Yet behind the celebration lay a sobering realization. The Cold War was no longer an abstraction. It had boundaries, victims, and heroes. For Stalin, the blockade had been a gamble that failed. He had hoped to force the West out of Berlin without firing a shot. Instead, he had united his adversaries and embarrassed his own cause. In 1949, only months after lifting the blockade, the Western powers formally created the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, with Bonn as its capital. In response, Moscow established the German Democratic Republic East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. One city, two nations, two worlds, divided by ideology and wire. The scars of that division ran deep. Families found themselves separated by borders that once did not exist. Telephone calls across sectors were monitored. Letters took weeks, sometimes months to arrive. The airlift had saved Berlin, but it had also confirmed its fate as the central stage of the Cold War, a city forever balancing between confrontation and coexistence. To the older generation of Americans, watching from afar, Berlin became a mirror of their own fears and hopes. The war they had fought had been against tyranny. Now tyranny had changed its face. But in the endurance of Berlin's citizens, they saw something familiar, the same stubborn resilience that had carried them through the Depression and the war. By the end of 1949, Berlin stood rebuilt in spirit, if not yet in stone. The airlift ended officially on September 30, its mission accomplished. Pilots flew their final ceremonial flights over the city, scattering candy parachutes one last time. Crowds gathered to cheer, waving homemade flags, tears glinting in the gray morning light. The airlift had done more than keep Berlin alive. It had drawn a clear moral boundary for the new world. The United States and its allies had proven that they would not abandon those trapped behind lines of oppression. And in doing so, they had drawn another invisible line, one that ran not just through Europe, but through the conscience of humanity itself. That line would hold for decades. Along it would stand soldiers, politicians, and ordinary people whose only weapon was endurance. The Cold War had found its first great confrontation, and though no battles were fought, it had already claimed its share of quiet victories and silent wounds. Berlin, once the symbol of conquest, had become the symbol of defiance. Its skies had carried not bombs but bread, not destruction but compassion, and as the planes finally fell silent, their echoes lingered, a steady heartbeat, reminding the world that courage need not always be loud. Sometimes it flies on silver wings through gray clouds, unseen but unforgettable. The red star rises in the east, 1949, 1953. By the time the last plane of the Berlin airlift had disappeared into the clouds, a new world had quietly formed beneath it. Two worlds, really mirror images, each claiming the light. On one side stood the West, rebuilding from the rubble with the help of American dollars and democratic promises. On the other side, behind a curtain of steel and secrecy, rose the Empire of the East, bound by ideology, discipline, and the conviction that history itself favored their cause. The red flag of the Soviet Union, once flown in victory over Berlin, now waved above half of Europe. It fluttered from the towers of Warsaw, Budapest, and Sofia, from ministries in Bucharest and Prague. These were the lands the Red Army had liberated from the Nazis. But liberation had slowly turned into something else: supervision, then control. Soviet advisors arrived, speaking the language of friendship and revolution, but carrying the authority of Moscow. Local communist parties, once partners in coalition governments, began to absorb, silence, or dissolve their rivals. Elections became predictable, newspapers obedient. A new order had taken shape, one wrapped in the vocabulary of equality but built on fear. In the West, the headlines called it expansion. In the East, it was called protection. To Stalin, each new satellite state was a brick in a defensive wall, one that would ensure no army would ever again reach the gates of Moscow. To Washington, it looked like conquest by another name. Europe, which had spent centuries fighting to unite, was now being split down its middle with the precision of a surgeon's knife. In 1949, the division became irreversible. The Western Allies joined their zones of occupation into a single nation, the Federal Republic of Germany, with Bonn as its capital. Almost immediately, the Soviet Union responded by creating its own state in the East, the German Democratic Republic, ruled from Berlin. Two Germanys now faced each other across the checkpoints and barbed wire, twins born of the same catastrophe but raised under different stars. That same year, in the quiet deserts of Kazakhstan, Soviet scientists detonated their first atomic bomb. The mushroom cloud rose over the steppe, blooming like a grim flower against the morning sky. The Americans had expected it, but not so soon. When reports reached President Truman, he read them in silence, the weight of inevitability pressing on his shoulders. The monopoly was over. The balance had changed forever. The world now lived beneath two suns, one red, one white-hot, with radiation. Each side possessed the power to erase the other, and yet both understood that to use it would mean mutual suicide. Out of that dread was born a strange kind of peace, one held together not by trust but by terror. Historians would later call it the balance of power, but to those who lived through it, it felt more like walking a tightrope above an abyss. Back in Moscow, Stalin watched these developments with the grim satisfaction of a man who believed the future was finally bending his way. The Soviet Union had survived the unthinkable, defeated fascism, rebuilt its cities, and now matched the Americans in atomic might. The party's newspapers declared that socialism was triumphant. The old man's portrait hung in every factory and classroom, his mustache rendered in clean, proud lines. Yet behind the carefully arranged parades and speeches, fear lingered in every corridor of power. To question was to disappear. Purges still swept through ministries and military ranks. Men toasted Stalin's health in the evening and vanished by morning. Even the highest generals lived with packed suitcases beside their doors, just in case the knock came at night. The Soviet system had become immense, disciplined, and watchful, a machine that never slept. And yet, to millions of ordinary Soviet citizens, life in those years carried a strange rhythm of pride and endurance. New apartments rose from the ruins, trains ran again, children studied science beneath red banners that promised a brighter tomorrow. The wounds of war began to heal, even as the shadow of secrecy grew thicker. The state provided what it could: bread, work, education. What it demanded in return was silence. Far beyond Europe, another revolution stirred the balance of power. In 1949, halfway across the world, the Chinese Civil War came to an end. Mao Zedong's communist forces entered Beijing in triumph, proclaiming the birth of the People's Republic of China. To Americans, the event was a thunderclap. A second great nation had turned red. In Washington, newspapers lamented the loss of China. In Moscow, Stalin smiled, cautiously. The world's most populous country had joined his ideological camp. though not under his control. The victory of communism in Asia rippled across continents. Anti-colonial movements in Africa and the Middle East took heart, seeing in the Soviet model not just power but promise. For nations long under European rule, socialism seemed a language of dignity, of self-determination without dependence. In Washington, it looked like a wildfire spreading too fast to contain. By 1950, the first true flashpoint arrived on the Korean peninsula. There, the map once again betrayed the world's fault lines. After Japan's surrender in 1945, Korea, once a single nation, had been divided along the 38th parallel. The North, backed by Moscow, built a communist state under Kim Il-sung. The South, supported by Washington, established a fragile democracy under Syngman Rhee. For a few uneasy years, the border remained quiet. Then, on a June morning in 1950, North Korean tanks rolled south. The invasion shocked the world. American newspapers awoke to headlines of war. The United Nations called emergency meetings. Truman, still haunted by the appeasement of the 1,930 seconds, resolved that aggression would not go unanswered. Within days, U.S. forces were on their way, fighting under the UN flag. The Korean War had begun not a world war, not yet, but a warning of what the Cold War might one day become. The fighting was brutal. Seoul changed hands several times. The peninsula burned with the same chaos Europe had only recently escaped. When Chinese troops entered the conflict to defend the North, the war widened. In Washington, talk of atomic weapons surfaced briefly, chilling the world once more. Yet neither side dared cross that final threshold. For soldiers, Korea was mud, snow, and confusion. For civilians, it was another reminder that peace was fragile, conditional. At home, Americans began to feel the unease of perpetual vigilance. The headlines never stopped. The sense of victory after World War II faded into something quieter, more anxious. And as the soldiers fought across the Korean hills, the Cold War deepened in laboratories and offices far from the front. The arms race accelerated. In 1952, the United States tested the first hydrogen bomb, a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the one dropped on Hiroshima. Its explosion turned the Pacific sky white. The next year, the Soviet Union followed with its own. The world's night had become permanent daylight, lit by the possibility of annihilation. Back in America, the fear seeped into everyday life. Schools held air raid drills. Children crouched beneath desks, tiny hands over their heads, as if wood and steel could stop radiation. Suburbs sprouted, backyard shelters stocked with canned beans and bottled water. Films and newsreels spoke of preparedness with cheerful music, masking dread with domestic order. The culture of safety became the culture of suspicion. It was in those years that the term Iron Curtain ceased to be metaphor and became reality. Trains crossing from Vienna to Prague passed through fences and searchlights. Travelers were searched for pamphlets, letters, or even Western cigarettes. The once fluid heart of Europe had hardened into two spheres, each suspicious of the other's heartbeat. Yet amid all this, life went on quietly, stubbornly. In Paris, cafes buzzed again with writers and dreamers. In Moscow, theaters filled with laughter from state-approved comedies. The ordinary rhythms of humanity continued under extraordinary circumstances. It was as if the world, aware of its own fragility, chose to keep breathing anyway. In the midst of this fragile normalcy, Stalin began to fade. By the early 1950 seconds, his health faltered. His paranoia deepened, his inner circle shrank. He saw conspiracies everywhere, plots among his doctors, his ministers, even his closest allies. When he died in March 1953, it was sudden but not surprising. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union through terror and triumph left behind an empire of fear and silence. Across the world, the news was met with a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. In the West, leaders wondered what would come next. In the east, crowds filled the streets to mourn, many out of habit, some out of genuine sorrow. For nearly 3 decades, Stalin's presence had been as constant as the seasons. Now, for the first time in a generation, the future seemed unwritten again. In Washington, Truman, nearing the end of his presidency, reflected on the strange course of history. When he had taken office in 1945, the world had been united by victory. Now it was divided by fear. Yet through it all, one belief had guided him that strength and principle could coexist. His doctrine of containment had become the cornerstone of American policy, shaping everything from Berlin to Korea. He had not sought the Cold War, but he had accepted its burden. By 1953, as a new American president prepared to take the oath of office, the lines of the world were firmly drawn. The red star shone over half the globe, proud and defiant. The stars and stripes stood firm in the other half, confident but cautious. Between them stretched not just borders, but decades of silence waiting to be filled. And so the world moved forward, 2 halves of one story, orbiting each other in wary balance. Beneath their rivalry, people built homes, raised children, planted gardens, and stared at the same stars, wondering which side of the sky truly belonged to them. The Cold War, though barely begun, had already seeped into every corner of existence. It was not only a war of nations, but of nerves, of ideas, of imagination itself. The red star had risen in the east, bright and unyielding. Its light would cast long shadows across continents and generations, until one day it would fade. But in these early years, 1949 to 1953, it burned fiercely, a symbol of triumph to some, a warning to others, and to everyone, a reminder that history rarely ends when we think it should. The Korean War, Fire and Frost, 1953. It began without warning on a quiet June morning in 1950. Across the rolling hills and rice paddies of the Korean peninsula, thunder rose not from the sky, but from tanks, their iron tracks grinding southward. Soldiers in gray uniforms advanced under a crimson flag, their rifles glinting in the dawn. Villagers woke to the rumble and the panic of retreating soldiers. The war that no one wanted had begun. For years after World War II, Korea had been a forgotten frontier, divided not by ancient rivalries, but by the pens of diplomats. In 1945, when Japan surrendered, the Allies had split the country along the 38th parallel for convenience, the Soviets taking the north, the Americans the south. It was meant to be temporary, a line drawn until elections could unite the nation again. But the line hardened, as lines do. By 1948, 2 governments stood face to face, each claiming to be the rightful ruler of all Korea. In the north, Kim Il-sung, a young revolutionary who had fought with Soviet partisans, built his state in Stalin's image. His capital, Pyongyang, filled with banners of red and portraits of Lenin. Schools taught songs of unity under socialism. The army swore allegiance to the idea of a single Korea liberated from imperialism. In the south, Syngman Rhee, an older nationalist educated in America, ruled with fiery speeches about freedom, though his government too was steeped in fear and repression. Between them lay a border lined with suspicion, where patrols glared at each other through fog and barbed wire. On the 25th of June, 1950, that border erupted. Kim's forces, armed and trained by Soviet advisors, swept south with astonishing speed. Seoul fell within days. Truman, woken in the middle of the night by an urgent call, listened as his advisors described the invasion. To him, it sounded like the first domino falling. If the United States allowed one free nation to be swallowed, others might follow from Japan to the Philippines, from Europe to anywhere hope flickered. He made his decision quickly. There would be no appeasement, no hesitation. The United States would act, not alone, but under the flag of the United Nations. Within hours, American air and naval forces were ordered to support the Republic of Korea. Britain, Australia, Canada, and other allies soon joined. It was not declared a world war, but it felt dangerously close. The first months were desperate. South Korean troops, under-equipped and overwhelmed, fell back toward the sea. By August, the defenders were trapped in a shrinking pocket around the port city of Pusan. The heat was unbearable, the ground soaked with rain and exhaustion. Supplies ran low. Newspapers in America printed maps that showed a thin crescent of territory still under UN control. Many wondered if another Dunkirk was coming. Then came a bold idea, one that would change the course of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding from Tokyo, proposed an amphibious landing far behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon. The plan was risky. The tides were treacherous, the coastline narrow. Even MacArthur's own staff doubted it, but the general was undeterred. "We shall land at Incheon," he said, "and I shall crush them." In September 1950, as dawn broke over the Yellow Sea, American warships began to bombard the coast. Landing craft surged toward the beaches. Within days, Seoul was liberated. The North Korean army, caught between two fronts, collapsed. The victory electrified the world. Truman, once criticized for indecision, now seemed vindicated. The tide had turned, but triumph can be blinding. The UN forces, flush with success, crossed the 38th parallel, pushing north toward the Yalu River, the border with China. MacArthur believed the war could be finished, the entire peninsula unified under democracy. In Washington, there were doubts, quiet but growing. China had warned repeatedly that it would not tolerate foreign troops on its frontier, yet the warnings were ignored. As the soldiers advanced into the frozen valleys of North Korea, winter came early. The temperature plunged, the rivers turned to glass, and snow fell silently over the wreckage of villages. Then, in late November, the mountains erupted. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu, their bugles wailing in the dark. They came on foot, wearing padded cotton uniforms, slipping through the snow like ghosts. The surprise was total. The UN forces reeled back in chaos. The Chosin Reservoir became a name carved into memory, a place of courage and catastrophe. American Marines fought their way out, surrounded on all sides, their rifles freezing in their hands. "We're not retreating," one officer famously said, "we're just advancing in another direction." When they finally reached the coast, the cold had claimed more lives than bullets. By early 1951, the war had settled into stalemate. Seoul changed hands again, then again. Lines moved, then froze. The fighting became positional hills captured, lost, retaken. Soldiers dug into the earth, while diplomats argued in distant rooms. For the men on the ground, it was a war of waiting, of cold mornings and restless nights. For civilians, it was displacement, hunger, and endless uncertainty. At home in America, the news was grim. The quick victory promised months earlier had become an open wound. Truman faced criticism from Congress, from newspapers, even from his own generals. MacArthur, impatient and proud, demanded the authority to strike Chinese bases across the border, even to use atomic weapons if necessary. When Truman refused, the general went public, turning the dispute into spectacle. The president had no choice but to relieve him of command. When MacArthur returned home, he was greeted with parades. Truman received threats. The division between military glory and political restraint would linger long after the war. Meanwhile, on the front lines, the soldiers endured. Nights were filled with the whistle of shells and the hollow wind sweeping through the hills. Letters home spoke of mud, frostbite, and the ache of distance. Yet there was also camaraderie, the kind forged only in hardship. Americans, Britons, Turks, Ethiopians, and South Koreans shared rations and stories, their differences blurred by the cold. In Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung's regime survived through sheer will and Soviet support. The city lay in ruins, its people scattered. Propaganda painted the struggle as a crusade against imperialism, and for many in the communist world, it was exactly that. In Moscow and Beijing, The war was proof that the West's power had limits. In Washington, it was proof that communism would never rest. The years dragged on. By 1952, the conflict had claimed millions of lives, soldiers, civilians, refugees caught in the shifting front lines. Negotiations began at Panmunjom, a small village that would soon become synonymous with stalemate. Across a simple wooden table, delegates debated for months over the shape of a conference table, the return of prisoners, the definition of peace itself. Outside, soldiers still died for hills that would be abandoned days later. Truman's presidency neared its end, and the burden of war weighed heavily. He had acted to contain communism, but the result was a frozen conflict with no victory in sight. When Dwight Eisenhower, the wartime hero, ran for office promising to end the war, weary Americans listened. In July 1953, after 3 years of blood and frost, an armistice was signed. The fighting stopped, the lines remained. The border was restored almost exactly where it had begun along the 38th parallel. No peace treaty followed, only silence. The Korean War was over, but not ended. For the soldiers returning home, it was a strange victory. There were no parades, no medals for triumph. They had fought to preserve, not to conquer. The war became known as the Forgotten War, overshadowed by the global tension that surrounded it. Yet its legacy was immense. It set the pattern for all that would follow. Limited wars fought in the shadow of nuclear weapons, where total victory was too dangerous to pursue. In Korea itself, the scars endured. The peninsula remained divided, its people separated by barbed wire and ideology. Families torn apart in 1950 would grow old, waiting for reunions that never came. Cities rebuilt, economies diverged, but the wound remained open, a living monument to the Cold War's first fire. In the years that followed, as America turned its gaze to Europe, to space, to the promise of technology, the memory of Korea lingered quietly in the minds of those who had seen it firsthand. They remembered the faces of children in burned villages, the frost clinging to helmets, the distant bugles echoing across white hills. They remembered the strange mixture of resolve and futility that defined that war, a war fought not to win the world, but to keep it from falling apart. For the old generals, Korea was a lesson in restraint. For the young soldiers, it was a lesson in endurance. And for the world, it was the moment the Cold War turned real, proving that the conflict between East and West would not remain frozen forever. When the guns finally quieted and the armistice lines hardened into fences and minefields, a stillness fell over the land, a deceptive calm. On maps, the border looked simple, a thin line across a small peninsula. But for the millions who lived beneath it, that line divided not just territory but time itself, past from future, hope from memory. The Cold War had found its first flame in Korea, and though the fire had been contained, its smoke drifted across oceans. It would linger for generations, a faint haze in the minds of those who had seen too much of war and too little of peace. And so the 1,950 seconds moved forward, the world older, sobered, and quietly afraid. The frost of Korea had shown what happened when ideology met the human heart, and how fragile even victory could be. Beneath the calm of treaties and armistices, the Cold War continued its slow, relentless rhythm, waiting for its next battlefield, its next test of endurance, and its next chapter in the long, uneasy dance between fire and frost. Behind closed doors, spies, secrets, and fear. 1953, 1957. The guns of Korea had quieted, but peace did not feel peaceful. It was the kind of silence that follows a deep storm, heavy, expectant, and filled with the sound of things unseen. Across oceans and borders, two powers circled each other in cautious stillness. Their armies were idle, but their minds were at war. And in the age that followed, it would be the hidden battles, the whispers, the codes, the shadows that defined the new front line of the Cold War. When Joseph Stalin died in March 1953, the world exhaled. For nearly 30 years, his iron will had bound the Soviet Union in silence and suspicion. Now, for the first time, The red star flickered uncertainly. Crowds poured into Moscow's streets to mourn the man who had built an empire out of fear. Inside the Kremlin, his successors Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and others moved quietly, each testing the new balance of power. The era of one man's terror was ending, but not the system that birthed it. In Washington, President Dwight D. Eisenhower watched with cautious curiosity. The general who had once commanded the Allied armies in Europe now led a nation that had grown restless with anxiety. Americans wanted calm, order, and prosperity after years of war. Eisenhower promised all three. His manner was steady, almost fatherly, a soldier who understood that sometimes the best way to win was not to fight at all. Yet even as he spoke of peace, the machinery of secrecy grew larger than ever before. Under his administration, the Central Intelligence Agency expanded its reach. Born only a few years earlier, the CIA was now an invisible arm of American policy, tasked with fighting a war that could never be openly declared. Its mission was simple in theory: to contain communism without triggering the apocalypse. But in practice, it was a labyrinth of shadows, coups, propaganda, and the delicate art of plausible deniability. The Soviets had their own mirror image, the KGB. To the West, it was a word that conjured menace, the image of agents in dark coats, listening at doors, moving through alleys where truth and loyalty were interchangeable. But to the Soviet state, it was the guardian of revolution, the shield that protected socialism from the deceit of capitalism. And so, as the decade unfolded, the two secret empires went to war, quietly, invisibly, and everywhere at once. In the alleys of Berlin, spies met in safe houses lit by single lamps. In the cafes of Vienna, men traded envelopes thick with photographs and false promises. Embassies became battlegrounds of charm and deception. Diplomats smiled across tables by day, and by night, their governments broke into one another's files. Each side watched the other with obsessive care. The Soviets planted moles in Western ministries. The CIA recruited defectors from the East. Every phone call might be tapped, every letter intercepted. The very air seemed to hum with secrecy. In those years, trust became the most precious and the most dangerous commodity in the world. At home in America, the fear of the unseen enemy seeped into daily life. Senator Joseph McCarthy, a man with a sharp tongue and a thirst for headlines, rose to prominence by promising to root out communists from within. He claimed they were everywhere, hiding in the State Department, in Hollywood, even in the army. To millions of Americans, weary from uncertainty, his accusations offered something intoxicating: certainty. Hearings were broadcast live, filling living rooms with the tense rhythm of accusation and denial. Writers, actors, and teachers found themselves questioned about their loyalties, their friendships, their thoughts. Careers ended with the turn of a phrase. It was an age of lists, lists of names, lists of enemies, lists of people to avoid. The land of the free was learning how fragile freedom could feel when fear took hold. Across the ocean, the Soviets conducted their own purges, though quieter, more methodical. Dissent was still treason. Curiosity was still suspect. Ordinary citizens learned to speak cautiously, to say enough to be loyal, but not enough to be remembered. The two worlds, so different in rhetoric, had begun to mirror each other in paranoia. Meanwhile, the race for knowledge accelerated. In universities and secret laboratories, scientists became the new soldiers. The nuclear arsenal was growing. Hydrogen bombs now measured destruction in megatons instead of kilotons. The Earth itself had become too small for the ambitions of power. The sky was the next frontier. In 1954, the United States launched Project Vanguard, an effort to explore space before the Soviets could. The early years were clumsy, full of failures and explosions broadcast on black and white television. But the race had begun, and everyone knew it. The world had entered the age of rockets, not yet for travel, but for fear. Missiles that could reach across continents were no longer theoretical. They were real, standing in silent forests and desert plains, waiting for a command that no one dared to give. To the older generation of Americans, who had lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War, this new kind of danger felt abstract, almost unreal. You could not dig trenches against a missile, nor see an enemy plane before it struck. Yet the fear was there, invisible and heavy. Families built fallout shelters beneath their homes. Magazines printed instructions for surviving nuclear blasts, how to hide, what to eat, how to wait. Children learned to duck beneath their desks as sirens wailed in practice drills. It was ritual more than protection, a way to believe control was possible. Eisenhower understood the absurdity and the necessity of it all. In private, he feared the military-industrial complex, the growing bond between defense industries, scientists, and government that fed on constant vigilance. In public, he spoke softly of strength through peace. His was a balancing act between optimism and realism, between the promise of safety and the truth that no one was safe anymore. In those same years, deep beneath Moscow, engineers were working on their own rockets. Under the direction of a brilliant and secretive scientist named Sergei Korolev, the Soviets were quietly perfecting machines that could carry both warheads and dreams. They said little of it then, but their laboratories were humming towards something that would soon change the sky forever. Beyond the battlefields of ideology and espionage, another front emerged, one fought with art, music, and words. Culture became a weapon, subtle but powerful. In the United States, jazz and Hollywood films carried images of freedom and prosperity to audiences worldwide. American exhibitions toured Europe, displaying refrigerators and cars as symbols of abundance. The Soviets countered with ballets, literature, and parades that celebrated unity and sacrifice. Even beauty became political. To older Americans watching from living rooms across the country, it was a strange, restless time. The nation seemed powerful beyond imagination, yet perpetually uneasy. Veterans of World War II now worked in offices and factories, raising families under the soft glow of televisions that carried both entertainment and warning. News of hydrogen tests in the Pacific flickered between sitcoms and baseball games. The Cold War was no longer distant, it had become the background music of daily life. In Europe, the reconstruction financed by the Marshall Plan was bearing fruit. Cities like Paris and Rome glittered once more. But in the East, life remained gray and regimented. Barbed wire lined the borders of Czechoslovakia and Hungary. Trains that once ran freely now stopped at checkpoints, manned by soldiers who inspected not only papers but faces, searching for intent. For the first time since 1945, the West began to feel not only superior but fortunate. It was a quiet kind of pride, one born not of conquest but of contrast. And yet, beneath the calm surface, cracks appeared even within the capitalist alliance. France and Britain struggled with fading empires. Colonial wars flared in Algeria and Indochina. America, though distant, could feel the tremors. Each conflict was a spark in the global contest for hearts and minds. In 1956, the world briefly held its breath again. In Eastern Europe, whispers of freedom began to stir. In Poland, workers protested food shortages. In Hungary, students filled the streets of Budapest, calling for reforms, for democracy, for the right to choose their own path. It was autumn, and the leaves of the Danube turned red, not with ideology, but with blood. For a few glorious days, it seemed possible that history might turn. The Hungarian Revolution bloomed like a fragile flower. Soviet statues fell, newspapers printed words once forbidden. But freedom came too soon. The Red Army returned with tanks and orders. The streets of Budapest filled with fire. Thousands fled across the border into Austria. The West watched, sympathetic but helpless. Eisenhower condemned the violence but dared not intervene. The risk of war was too great. That same year, another crisis unfolded far to the south. In Egypt, President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, seizing control from British and French companies. In response, Britain, France, and Israel invaded, seeking to reclaim it by force. The world, already weary of conflict, recoiled. Eisenhower, angered by the reckless act of his own allies, demanded they withdraw. It was a moment of revelation. The old empires of Europe were fading, and a new balance was taking shape. The twin crises of 1956 Budapest and Suez marked the Cold War's first great turning point. The Soviet Union had shown it would crush rebellion to preserve its empire. The United States had shown it would restrain even its friends to preserve order. And between them lay a world that no longer believed in easy heroes. As the decade drew to a close, the fog of fear began to settle into routine. The spy stories continued, but they became almost ordinary. A pilot captured here, a defector there. The newspapers wrote of new inventions, of computers that filled rooms, of rockets reaching for the heavens. The Cold War had become not a crisis, but a condition woven into the fabric of existence. For those who had lived through the Depression, the wars, and now this long-shadowed peace, life carried an odd rhythm, progress and paranoia walking hand in hand. They planted gardens, bought radios, sent children to college, and all the while kept one cautious eye on the horizon. The age of overt battles had ended. The age of invisible ones had begun. By 1957, when the first Soviet satellite prepared to launch into the sky, humanity stood on the edge of something both wondrous and terrifying. The world had grown smaller, faster, more connected, and far more fragile. Every triumph in science brought with it a deeper question of survival. The Cold War had learned to whisper instead of shout. Its armies slept, its spies did not, and its secrets, locked behind closed doors, hummed softly beneath the everyday world, an unseen current in the great ocean of history. And for those who lay awake at night, hearing the wind against their windows, it was comforting to believe that maybe, somewhere, the people on the other side of the curtain did the same, listening to their own quiet, wondering what the morning would bring. The age of missiles and men, 1957, 1961. It was a clear autumn evening in 1957 when the world first looked up and realized the sky had changed forever. A soft point of light moved across the heavens, steady, deliberate, and unlike any star that had ever shone before. People stepped out of diners and movie theaters, craning their necks to watch. Children in backyards whispered in awe. Somewhere, high above, a small metal sphere called Sputnik, one drifted silently around the Earth, beeping its steady heartbeat through the void. The sound was faint, but its meaning thundered through every capital on Earth. The age of missiles and men had begun. For the Soviet Union, Sputnik was triumph proof that socialism could reach the heavens. For the United States, it was a shock that pierced the night like a flare. Newspapers called it the shock heard round the world. In schools and cafes, people asked the same fearful question. If the Russians could launch a satellite, could they not also launch a warhead that would fall from the same sky? President Dwight Eisenhower, calm as ever, tried to reassure the nation. He reminded Americans that science should be met with science, not panic. Yet beneath his steady words, Washington trembled. In the Pentagon's maps and laboratories, the balance of power seemed to tilt eastward. The United States had thought itself years ahead in technology. Now it was chasing a glimmer in the heavens. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev smiled broadly before the cameras, proud of his engineers, proud of his people. "We will bury you," he had once said, not with bombs, he now claimed, but with progress. For him, the satellite was more than a scientific victory. It was proof that the Soviet system could outthink and outbuild the capitalist West. The propaganda wrote itself. Across Eastern Europe, radios broadcast the beeping of Sputnik as if it were the voice of the future. The following month, the Soviets launched Sputnik 2. Carrying a living passenger, a small stray dog named Laika. She orbited alone, a symbol of courage and sacrifice. To the Soviets, she was a heroine. To the West, her lonely voyage was both wondrous and tragic. For all humanity, she became the first living being to leave the world and never return. In response, the United States moved with urgency. Scientists at Cape Canaveral worked around the clock, assembling rockets under floodlights that cut through the Florida night. Their early efforts were humbling. On national television, one rocket wobbled on the pad, rose a few feet, and collapsed in flames. Reporters dubbed it Kaputnik. The laughter stung, but behind it was fear, a deep sense that the United States had fallen behind not just in space, but in destiny. Out of that embarrassment came determination. Eisenhower approved the creation of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration (NASA) in 1958. What began as a response to humiliation would become one of humanity's greatest endeavors. Yet in those first years, the agency's purpose was not exploration, it was reassurance. Americans needed to believe again that their nation could lead, not follow. While the world's eyes turned upward, its dangers remained rooted firmly on Earth. The same rockets that lifted satellites into orbit could just as easily deliver nuclear warheads across continents. Both superpowers built fleets of intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs) that could reach any target within minutes. To guard against them, each began constructing networks of radar stations, command bunkers, and underground silos. A single launch, intentional or mistaken, could set off a chain no one could stop. Eisenhower understood the irony. The very weapons meant to along Table, preserve peace, made peace more fragile than ever. Still, he saw in technology a kind of inevitability. Our safety, he said, lies not in armaments alone, but in understanding. Yet understanding was hard to come by when fear hummed through the wires of every telephone and echoed in every diplomatic message. In 1958, the United States tested the first Atlas missile, a sleek silver column that roared into the sky and left a trail of fire over the Pacific. The success was hailed as proof that the missile gap might yet be closed. But Khrushchev boasted of hundreds of rockets already in Soviet stockpiles. No one knew the truth, and that uncertainty was itself a weapon. Each side exaggerated not only to frighten the other but to calm its own people. Thus, the arms race became a theater of mirrors where illusion mattered as much as reality. The new decade brought with it a sense of restless energy. In cities across America, modernity was on full display. Tail fins on cars, television antennas like miniature rockets, and music that seemed to leap forward with every beat. But under the hum of prosperity, the Cold War kept its steady rhythm. The launch of every satellite, the test of every bomb, reminded citizens that progress and peril had become twins. In the Soviet Union, Khrushchev preached a gospel of abundance too. "We will catch up and surpass America," he declared to cheering crowds. Factories ran day and night, harvest quotas filled newspapers with slogans. To prove his nation's technological prowess, he invited Western journalists to tour Soviet industry. They saw new steel mills, power plants, and model farms, but they also saw the shortages, the gray apartments, and the guarded faces. The USSR was vast and proud, but it was also brittle, built on promises that strained against reality. In 1959, Khrushchev made a bold and unexpected move. He traveled to the United States. It was the first visit by a Soviet leader to the American homeland, and it unfolded like a mixture of theater and curiosity. He arrived, smiling, waving his hat, speaking of friendship. Americans lined the streets to catch a glimpse of the man who, only years earlier, had spoken of burying them. Khrushchev toured factories, farms, and supermarkets. In a California grocery store, he marveled at aisles filled with fruit, bread, and meat. "This," he said, "is abundance." Reporters noted his wonder, and so did his aides. For all his bluster, he understood what such abundance meant to ordinary people. In Moscow, lines for butter were still common. The trip ended with a visit to Camp David, where he met Eisenhower amid the quiet of Maryland's hills. For 2 days they talked not as enemies, but as men trying to steer history away from disaster. They agreed to keep talking. For a moment, the world breathed easier, yet diplomacy, like weather, can change without warning. In May 1960, an American U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured alive. The U.S. at first claimed it was a weather plane gone astray, but the Soviets revealed the wreckage and the pilot's confession. The lie stung more than the loss. Khrushchev, furious, cancelled a planned summit in Paris and stormed out of the conference. The fragile trust built at Camp David crumbled overnight. The U-2 incident revealed something that both nations had long denied aloud. Even in times of supposed calm, the Cold War never slept. The skies were thick with surveillance, the oceans filled with submarines that carried silent death beneath the waves. Each side sought to know everything about the other while pretending to know nothing at all. Meanwhile, the nuclear stockpiles grew. The United States developed the Polaris missile, capable of launching from submarines deep beneath the sea. The Soviet Union built its own fleets of missile-armed submarines, patrolling the Arctic. The strategy of mutual assured destruction had taken shape, though few dared to say it aloud. The idea was chilling in its logic. If both sides were certain that war would mean extinction, neither would start one. It was peace by paralysis, a balance of terror. For ordinary Americans, that terror became background noise. They watched newsreels of mushroom clouds rising in the desert, their shapes strangely beautiful against the blue sky. They trusted their leaders, mostly, but they also began to question what kind of world they were building for their children. Ministers preached about morality in the atomic age. Scientists debated ethics in conferences behind closed doors. The Cold War had begun to touch the soul as well as the state. And yet, amid the anxiety, there was wonder. The race for space had awakened a new curiosity in humanity. In 1961, the Soviets achieved another milestone. Yuri Gagarin, a young pilot with a bright smile, became the first human to orbit the Earth. When his capsule returned safely, the world erupted in applause. Gagarin's words, "I see Earth, it is beautiful," floated across radio waves like poetry. For a fleeting moment, even those who feared the Soviets felt awe instead of anger. In the United States, the achievement struck deep pride and deeper worry. America had sent animals into space, but not yet a man. President Eisenhower was nearing the end of his term, and the question of leadership, both scientific and moral, hung in the air. The upcoming election promised change, youth, and vigor. The nation was ready for a new voice, someone who could speak not only of defense, but of destiny. That voice arrived in John F. Kennedy, a senator from Massachusetts whose charm and eloquence seemed to cut through the fog of fear. He spoke of a new frontier, of challenges to be met not with dread but with courage. To an older generation, still haunted by depression and war, he was the face of their children's hopes, the proof that the American experiment could renew itself. To the young, he was simply inspiration. When Kennedy took the oath of office in January 1961, snow flurries drifted over the Capitol. In his inaugural address, he declared, "Let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate." The words were measured, graceful, and they carried a quiet defiance. They were also a promise that the struggle of the Cold War would not only be about bombs and borders, but about ideals and imagination. Behind the ceremony, the machinery of the Cold War hummed on. Missiles remained in their silos, submarines beneath the sea, satellites in orbit. Yet, for a moment, listening to that young voice echo through the cold January air, it was possible to believe that reason might still triumph over rivalry. As the 1,950 seconds gave way to the 1,960 seconds, humanity stood poised between terror and transcendence. Technology had given the species both wings and shackles. The same engines that could carry a man into orbit could also turn cities to ash. The same mathematics that guided spacecraft guided missiles. The age of missiles and men was, above all, an age of contradiction, where dreams and nightmares shared the same sky. For the older generation, those contradictions were deeply felt. They remembered a world before radar and rockets, before television and telephones carried voices across continents. They had seen empires fall, seen nations rebuilt, and now watched as their grandchildren gazed up at the stars with both wonder and worry. It was progress, yes, but progress with a tremor in its hands. In the quiet of American suburbs, families gathered around black and white televisions to watch Gagarin's smiling face, then turned to gaze at their own sky. Somewhere up there, invisible yet present, men were testing machines that could end or transform civilization. It was a strange new intimacy, the realization that the future no longer belonged to distant generals or kings, but to scientists, engineers, and the politicians who listened to them. By the end of 1961, the optimism of Kennedy's early months would begin to be tested. Crises brewed in places few Americans could find on a map. The island of Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, would soon become the next flashpoint. Berlin, still divided, trembled once again as refugees fled from east to west. The world, despite all its satellites and slogans, remained fragile. But those moments were yet to come. For now, the earth turned beneath a sky that no longer belonged solely to dreamers or poets. It belonged to mathematicians and soldiers, to visionaries and bureaucrats, to men who built engines of both wonder and warning. Each night, as that small Soviet satellite still traced its fading path across the heavens, countless eyes followed it, some with pride, some with envy, most with awe. It glided silently over deserts and oceans, over Moscow and Washington alike, a single bright reminder that despite all divisions, humanity shared one fragile world and one boundless sky. And down below, in the quiet homes of those who had lived long enough to see the world reborn and rearmed, the light of Sputnik faded into memory. They turned off their televisions, locked their doors, and whispered goodnight to a century that refused to sleep. The Cold War's next dawn would bring new faces, new fears, and the first true test of Kennedy's promise. For now, the stars watched in silence, steady, ancient, and patient, as the age of missiles and men carried humanity deeper into its own reflection. Cuba, the world on the edge, 1961, 1962. The Caribbean Sea in the early 1960s shimmered like glass, blue and endless. Yet beneath that calm surface, the world's heartbeat quickened. It was a time when geography and ideology met at a crossroads. A small island sitting less than 100 miles from the Florida coast would become the most dangerous place on Earth. The story of the Cold War's most perilous moment began not with missiles or generals, but with revolution. In 1959, the island of Cuba, long ruled by the authoritarian Fulgencio Batista, fell to a young bearded rebel named Fidel Castro. He rode into Havana atop a tank, greeted by crowds who threw flowers and shouted promises of a new dawn. For ordinary Cubans tired of corruption, inequality, and foreign domination, it felt like redemption. For Washington, it was something else entirely. For decades, Cuba had been an American playground. Its sugar plantations, hotels, and ports were woven tightly into U.S. business interests. Now, under Castro's new government, all of that began to unravel. American companies were nationalized, wealthy landowners fled north, and the new leader's rhetoric turned fiery and defiant. At first, the Eisenhower administration hoped to sway him with diplomacy, but Castro had already begun turning toward Moscow. He spoke of social justice, independence, and revolution. To many in the United States, it sounded dangerously familiar, another domino falling toward communism. By 1961, the new president, John F. Kennedy, inherited a plan born under Eisenhower, a secret operation to overthrow Castro using Cuban exiles trained by the CIA. The plan was ambitious and reckless, relying on secrecy, surprise, and the hope that the Cuban people would rise against their own government. It would be called the Bay of Pigs invasion. In April 1961, just 3 months after Kennedy's inauguration, a small army of exiles landed on Cuba's southern coast. They expected to be greeted as liberators. Instead, they were surrounded, outnumbered, and swiftly crushed. Castro's forces captured hundreds. The invasion was a disaster, a humiliation broadcast to the entire world. Kennedy, young and idealistic, suddenly found himself bloodied in the arena of global politics. The Soviets laughed, the Americans grimaced, and the fragile new president learned a brutal lesson. In the Cold War, failure carried echoes that reached across oceans. Yet Castro emerged stronger than ever. He stood before the cameras in his olive-green uniform, cigar in hand, and declared Cuba a socialist state. He turned fully toward the Soviet Union, signing trade agreements and welcoming Soviet advisors. For Nikita Khrushchev, it was an opportunity too tempting to ignore. Here was a chance to place the Soviet flag in the Western Hemisphere, just beyond America's doorstep, a mirror to the American bases in Europe and Turkey that encircled his own borders. By 1962, Soviet ships began crossing the Atlantic with unusual cargo missiles, troops, and the promise of protection. The shipments were disguised as agricultural equipment, but American intelligence soon picked up whispers of something far more sinister. In October, U-2 reconnaissance planes, those same high-flying eyes that had once humiliated Eisenhower, photographed long, narrow shadows on Cuban soil. They were unmistakable. Nuclear missile sites under standby construction. When the photographs reached Washington, the world's calm dissolved in an instant. Kennedy's advisors gathered in the cabinet room, faces pale under the weight of what they saw. Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of striking Washington, New York, and most of the eastern seaboard, were being installed just minutes away by air. The logic was simple but terrifying. If the Soviets completed those sites, they would achieve nuclear parity in the most direct and dangerous way possible. For 13 days in October 1962, the Earth held its breath. Historians would call it the Cuban Missile Crisis. Those who lived through it simply remembered the feeling, that quiet dread that hung in the air, the sense that the world could end not with a scream but with a single phone call gone wrong. Kennedy's team debated through sleepless nights. Some urged an immediate airstrike to destroy the missiles before they became operational. Others feared such a move would trigger a Soviet counterattack in Europe or even nuclear war. The Joint Chiefs pressed for invasion. The diplomats begged for time. Kennedy, walking a tightrope between caution and courage, chose a third path. A naval quarantine, a blockade by another name. On October 22, the president addressed the nation in a televised speech that millions watched in silence. His voice was calm but unyielding. He revealed the existence of the missiles and announced that any attack launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union itself. He demanded their immediate removal. The images of missiles, laid out for all to see, turned speculation into fear. Across the country, people lined up at gas stations and grocery stores, stocked basements with canned goods, and prayed. In schools, children practiced duck and cover drills with renewed urgency. Clergy spoke of Armageddon. Newspapers ran maps showing the estimated blast radius over American cities. The doomsday clock ticked closer to midnight. In Moscow, Khrushchev bristled at the challenge but knew he had overplayed his hand. The Soviet leader admired boldness, but he feared humiliation even more. He sent a letter to Kennedy first, emotional, almost pleading, then another, harsher, filled with threats. As the days passed, American ships took up positions in the Caribbean, intercepting Soviet vessels headed for Cuba. The world watched as the two greatest navies on Earth faced each other across a line invisible but absolute. At any moment, a misunderstanding could have ended civilization. A nervous captain, a misread radar blip, or an overzealous pilot might have lit the match. Yet amid the tension, a strange restraint prevailed. The Soviet ship slowed, then stopped. Diplomacy, whispered through secret channels, began to take hold. In one of the most remarkable acts of quiet negotiation in modern history, both men stepped back from the edge. Kennedy agreed secretly to remove American missiles from Turkey, missiles that had long threatened the Soviet border, but only if Khrushchev withdrew his from Cuba. The agreement would remain undisclosed for years, protecting Kennedy's public image while allowing Khrushchev to claim a quiet victory at home. On October 28, the Soviet leader announced that the missiles would be dismantled. The ships turned back. The tension broke like a fever. The world had come within a breath of annihilation and survived. In Washington, there were no celebrations, only relief. Kennedy's hair had grayed in a matter of weeks. His approval soared, but more importantly, his understanding deepened. He had faced the abyss and refused to leap. For Khrushchev, the retreat was costly. The Soviet military fumed at what it saw as capitulation, and his authority began to wane. But for humanity, both men had done something extraordinary. They had recognized that survival mattered more than victory. The aftermath of the crisis reshaped the Cold War. A direct communication line, the hotline, was established between the Kremlin and the White House. A red telephone meant to prevent future misunderstandings. In truth, it was not a phone at all, but a teletype circuit designed for clarity over emotion. Still, it became a symbol, the idea that even in enmity, dialogue was possible. In the months that followed, both nations began to step back, ever so slightly, from the edge. Kennedy spoke at American University in 1963, calling for a re-examination of attitudes toward peace. His speech was gentle, almost philosophical, arguing that the Soviets, like Americans, breathe the same air and cherish their children's future. For a moment, it seemed the Cold War might thaw not through conquest, but through understanding. The same year, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty was signed, banning tests in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It was a modest step, but symbolically immense. It suggested that perhaps, after decades of rivalry, both sides were learning the limits of fear. For the older generation watching at home, the crisis left an indelible mark. They had lived through world wars, depressions, and now this a confrontation that nearly erased the world they had rebuilt. They understood, in a way younger generations could not, how thin the line between life and oblivion had become. Many remembered the radio broadcasts, the anxious newscasters, the hush that fell over neighborhoods as families listened together, waiting for any word. When the resolution finally came, it was not joy they felt, but exhaustion. The world had survived, but something inside it had changed. For Cuba, however, survival came at a price. The island became a fortress, armed to the teeth, isolated from the West. Castro emerged as both hero and hostage, protected by the Soviet Union but bound to its will. The embargo imposed by the United States tightened, freezing relations for decades. The revolution that had begun with idealism became, over time, a symbol of defiance in a world divided by ideology. In Moscow, Khrushchev used the crisis to argue for peace, but his standing within the Soviet elite weakened. By 1964, he would be quietly removed from power, replaced by the more cautious Leonid Brezhnev. The old man who had once pounded his shoe at the United Nations was left to watch history move on without him. And in America, Kennedy's calm under pressure became legend. Yet his story, too, would soon end abruptly, in a Dallas motorcade the following year. His death left a void, not only in politics, but in hope. The Cold War, despite its brief moment of restraint, continued on colder, quieter, and somehow even more personal. For those who lived through it, the Cuban Missile Crisis was more than a headline. It was a moment when time seemed to hold its breath. Old soldiers compared it to the days before battle, that same eerie stillness where everything familiar becomes precious. The hum of a geo's fell refrigerator, the sound of a radio, a child's laughter, each felt fragile, like things borrowed from a world that might soon vanish. In the years afterward, the phrase, "the world on the edge," would become shorthand for those 13 days in October. But for many, it described something larger, a realization that humanity itself had reached the limits of its power. Never before had mankind possessed the ability to destroy its own home. Never before had it been so aware of that power. Late at night, in both Washington and Moscow, lights burned in offices where men continued to calculate trajectories, yields, and probabilities. But somewhere beyond the papers and machines, a quieter truth had taken root. The Cold War would go on, but those who guided it would never again forget how close they had come to ending everything. And as the years passed, as satellites multiplied and doctrines evolved, the memory of Cuba lingered like a scar beneath the surface of the world's calm. It was proof that even at the height of division, reason could prevail, and that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that leave no triumph at all, only silence, relief, and the slow, grateful return of ordinary days. Shadows in the Third World 1963. 1975. After the thunder of Cuba faded into uneasy calm, the Cold War did not rest. It changed shape, slipping from the open skies of missiles into the jungles, deserts, and backrooms of a world still finding its place after empire. The map was no longer just divided between East and West, it was being rewritten by the restless energy of dozens of new nations rising from colonial rule. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the flags of old empires came down, and in their place fluttered banners of independence, hope, and hunger. Yet almost every new birth came with a shadow. For both Washington and Moscow, these newborn states were prizes in a global contest for loyalty and ideology. And so began the quiet wars of the Third World, fought not for territory, but for influence, wars waged in whispers, in jungles, and sometimes in silence. In 1963, the air still carried the echo of Kennedy's voice calling for peace. But that November, gunfire in Dallas ended more than a presidency. It ended an era of optimism. The torch passed to Lyndon B. Johnson, a man of tremendous will and deep weariness, who inherited a nation grieving and a conflict that was only beginning to reveal its depth, a place called Vietnam. The story of Vietnam did not begin with America, it began with empire. For almost a century, France had ruled the region it called Indochina. After World War II, Vietnamese nationalists, led by the quiet and determined Ho Chi Minh, sought independence. Ho quoted the American Declaration of Independence in his own speech, hoping Washington might understand his cause. But in the fevered logic of the Cold War, nationalism and communism had begun to blur into the same threat. When the fevered logic of the same threat, French tried and failed to reclaim their colony, America stepped in to fill the vacuum, not out of conquest, but out of fear that another domino might fall. By the mid-1962, U.S. advisors and aircraft were already deep in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964, murky, confusing, yet decisive, gave Johnson the authority to escalate. What began as a mission to support an ally became an all-out war, fought with the world's most advanced machinery against an enemy that seemed to dissolve into the very landscape. American bombers pounded the north, soldiers trudged through monsoon rain and rice paddies that swallowed boots whole. The television brought it all home, grainy footage of jungle fires and helicopters hovering over smoke-filled clearings. For the first time, war entered American living rooms in color. To the men who fought there, Vietnam was not a chessboard. It was heat, exhaustion, and the echo of unseen movement in the trees. To their parents watching from afar, it became a question that pierced the heart of the American story. How could the arsenal of democracy lose its way in a war against farmers and students? The answers were complex, and none of them were comforting. For Washington, the logic was simple, but relentless. If Vietnam fell, neighboring countries would follow. The domino theory guided policy as if it were gravity. Yet each push to stop one domino only seemed to topple another. As casualties rose, so did doubt. Young Americans, born after World War II, began to question not just the war, but the assumptions of their parents' world. College campuses filled with songs, protests, and grief. Mothers pinned yellow ribbons. Fathers turned off the news. The Cold War, once a distant contest between ideologies, had come home. In Moscow and Beijing, the war was viewed through a different lens, proof that capitalism's confidence could bleed. The Soviets and Chinese funneled weapons, fuel, training to the north, each hoping to claim the moral high ground in the global revolutionary struggle. Yet even among communists, unity was fragile. The Sino-Soviet split, already widening since the late 1952, deepened as Mao Zedong accused Khrushchev of cowardice and revisionism. The communist world itself fractured into rival camps, each claiming to be the true guardian of revolution. The very movement that promised unity was now divided by pride. Meanwhile, in the shadows of these rivalries, Africa and the Middle East became new arenas. As the old European empires receded, Washington and Moscow courted their successors. In the Congo, after independence in 1960, chaos erupted. The charismatic leader Patrice Lumumba, who had spoken passionately about true sovereignty, was overthrown and killed with the quiet approval of Western interests. The CIA called it containment. The Soviets called it murder. For the people of the Congo, it was simply tragedy. In the deserts of Egypt, another figure rose to prominence, Gamal Abdel Nasser, whose voice carried across the Arab world. He spoke of dignity, of pan-Arab unity, of breaking free from Western domination. To Washington, Nasser was unpredictable. To Moscow, he was useful. Soviet engineers helped build the Aswan Dam, a symbol of progress and partnership. American diplomats watched uneasily as the balance of power in the Middle East began to shift. Further east, in Indonesia, Sukarno walked a perilous tightrope between East and West, balancing nationalism, communism, and his own populist dreams. When his balancing act collapsed in the mid-1960s, the result was brutal. Anti-communist purges swept through the islands, leaving rivers stained and families shattered. The West welcomed the new order that followed, seeing in it another domino stabilized. Few asked at what cost. Through these years, Washington's idealism hardened into something pragmatic and weary. Kennedy had once promised to bear any burden. By the grieved time Johnson left office, America bore too many. In the jungles of Vietnam, soldiers fought for hilltops they could not pronounce, only to abandon them days later. The Tet Offensive of 1968, though a military failure for the North, shattered the illusion of progress. Television screens showed embassies under attack, and Walter Cronkite, the trusted voice of American evenings, declared the war unwinnable. When the anchor's calm broke, the nation's confidence broke with it. Protest turned into division. Young men burned draft cards, parents hung flags. Politicians spoke of law and order. The Cold War had always been framed as good versus evil, freedom versus tyranny. But Vietnam blurred those lines until they vanished in the smoke. Abroad, allies questioned America's wisdom. At home, the generation gap became a chasm. When Richard Nixon entered the White House in 1969, he promised a new approach, not withdrawal, not victory, but peace with honor. Behind closed doors, that meant diplomacy with old enemies. He and his advisor, Henry Kissinger, began to reshape the map through conversation rather than confrontation. They sought a way to use the divisions between Moscow and Beijing to America's advantage. It was the beginning of triangular diplomacy, a cold geometry that replaced ideology with strategy. Yet even as words replaced weapons in some arenas, the fighting in Vietnam dragged on. Nixon expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos, hoping to cut supply lines and pressure the North into negotiation. Instead, the bombings stirred global outrage. In 1970, 4 students were shot dead at Kent State University during an anti-war protest, young lives caught in the echo of faraway battles. The sound of gunfire on an American campus seemed to close a circle that had begun with gunfire in Dallas. By 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. the United States withdrew its last combat troops. 2 years later, Saigon fell. Helicopters lifted off from embassy rooftops as crowds of desperate South Vietnamese clung to their landing struts. The images were seared into memory. The war that began with advisors and optimism ended in evacuation and silence. The world's mightiest nation had learned, painfully, that technology could not always command history. But even as Vietnam consumed attention, other fires burned quietly across the globe. In Latin America, the Cold War took on its own rhythm, one of coups, whispers, and disappearances. The CIA-backed anti-communist forces in Guatemala, Chile, and beyond, convinced that each intervention was a defense of democracy. In 1973, the Chilean military, with covert American support, overthrew President Salvador Allende, the world's first freely elected Marxist leader. His successor, Augusto Pinochet, ruled with an iron fist. To Washington, Chile had been saved from communism. To Chileans, it had traded one fear for another. In Central America, civil wars simmered under the surface, fueled by ideology and poverty. Across continents, the pattern repeated. One side backed by Moscow, the other by Washington, both claiming to defend freedom. For those caught in between peasants, workers, students, the words meant little. They simply wanted to live. Africa, too, became a stage for Cold War rivalries. When Portugal's colonial empire collapsed in the 1972, new nations like Angola and Mozambique were born amid chaos. Soviet and Cuban forces supported socialist factions. The United States and South Africa backed their rivals. The jungles of Angola echoed with accents from Havana to Pretoria. The Cold War had become a truly global web, each strand vibrating with tension, each tug pulling at the others. Through all these conflicts, a strange paradox emerged. The superpowers fought everywhere except directly against each other. They bled through others, as if the world itself were a chessboard and human lives its expendable pieces. And yet, despite the cruelty of that logic, there was a grim stability to it. Neither side dared cross the final line. Back in Washington, Nixon's grand diplomacy reached its most astonishing moment in 1972 when he stepped onto Chinese soil. Cameras captured the handshake with Mao Zedong, two men who had spent their lives on opposite ends of the ideological spectrum smiling stiffly beneath red banners. It was a moment of theater and transformation. By opening to China, Nixon hoped to isolate Moscow and end years of hostility. For the first time in decades, the Cold War had shifted from confrontation to calculation. Later that same year, Nixon traveled to Moscow and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, the first real attempt to cap the number of nuclear weapons each side possessed. The handshake between Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev was cautious, but real. For a brief period, the world dared to believe that reason might find room in rivalry. The word détente relaxation entered the general détente relaxation political lexicon. But détente was not peace, it was merely exhaustion given diplomatic form. At home, America was tired. The oil shocks of 1973 dimmed the lights in its cities. The Watergate scandal dimmed the trust in its institutions. The same president who had promised honor left office in disgrace. For the older generation, it was a painful irony. The man who had opened the doors of diplomacy had closed the door on faith in government. Yet history, like the Cold War itself, rarely offered tidy resolutions. As the 1972 advanced, the map of the world was thick with the fingerprints of both superpowers. Aid, weapons, and ideology flowed into every corner, but so did disillusionment. The once bright banners of liberation in Africa and Asia faded under corruption and poverty. In the Middle East, conflict burned without pause: the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the oil embargo, each event another reminder that no region was immune to the tug-of-war between Moscow and Washington. And yet, amid this turbulence, something quieter endured: a longing for normalcy. In the United States, families bought their first color televisions, watched astronauts walk on the moon, and sent their children to schools integrated by new laws and hard courage. In the Soviet Union, families queued for bread and television sets of their own, dreaming of small comforts. Beneath the ideological noise, the ordinary rhythm of human life continued: births, weddings, laughter, and prayer. People lived, even in the shadow of superpowers. For those who had come of age in the 1930 seconds and 40 seconds, the Cold War's spread into the Third World felt like an echo of older empires, dressed in modern language. They had seen the same pattern before: promises of freedom, followed by foreign advisors and familiar debts. The difference now was that the colonizers were invisible, their presence measured not in flags but in funding, not in armies but in ideology. It was empire without conquest, influence without occupation. By 1975, as the helicopters left Saigon and Angola's civil war deepened, both superpowers stood at once triumphant and uncertain. The United States had contained communism, but at immense moral and human cost. The Soviet Union had expanded its reach, but its economy strained under the weight of aid, arms, and bureaucracy. The rest of the world looked on, weary and wise, knowing that every favor came with a chain. When the decade ended, the Third World was no longer a background stage, it was the main theater. The Cold War had woven itself into the lives of people who had never heard of Marx or Madison. Children in Angola, farmers in Vietnam, miners in Chile, poets in Prague, all lived within the invisible weather system of that vast rivalry. And as the superpowers counted missiles and measured influence, few stopped to notice that something else was happening beneath the surface. The human spirit, quiet, stubborn, and patient, was learning how to survive between the cracks of ideology. The Cold War could shape nations, but it could not fully claim hearts. In villages, markets, and cities, from Cairo to Managua, life continued fragile, persistent, defiant. When the sun set on 1975, the world was older, wiser, and infinitely more complicated than when it had entered the decade. The great powers had learned to fight without firing directly, to win without victory, to lose without surrender. But the shadows they cast across the developing world were long and cold, and they would linger for generations. The Cold War had moved beyond borders. It now lived in the choices of small nations, the headlines of distant newspapers, and the quiet calculations of farmers deciding which side's aid to accept. The battle between capitalism and communism had become not a war of armies, but a contest for the soul of the modern world. And through it all, from the rice fields of Asia to the savannas of Africa, from the jungles of Latin America to the deserts of the Middle East, ordinary people looked up at the same sky that once held Sputnik, wondering when the world above would finally let them rest. Détente, the thaw that never lasted. 1975, 1980. The mid-1970 seconds arrived not with fanfare, but with fatigue. The long decade of confrontation from Korea to Cuba to Vietnam had left the world weary. The Cold War, once burning with the heat of ideology, now smoldered quietly beneath the surface of global life. Superpower leaders no longer spoke of victory, they spoke of management, of understanding, of balance. The word that came to define this fragile moment was détente, a French term for relaxation, as if the world itself had decided to loosen its shoulders and exhale. But détente was not peace. It was the intermission in a play whose actors were still whispering behind the curtain. The audience, the billions who lived beneath the banners of East and West, waited, hoping that maybe this time the story would change. In the summer of 1975, a meeting in Helsinki, Finland, seemed to promise exactly that. Leaders from 35 nations gathered to sign what would be called the Helsinki Accords, a grand document declaring that borders in Europe were inviolable, that human rights were universal, and that cooperation, not confrontation, would guide the future. The pens glided smoothly over the paper, and for a moment the world looked civilized again. In Moscow, Leonid Brezhnev, now aging and heavy, saw Helsinki as the crowning achievement of his steady leadership. It symbolized respect, recognition that the Soviet sphere in Eastern Europe was legitimate and permanent. In Washington, Gerald Ford, who had taken the presidency after Nixon's fall, signed the accords too, though cautiously. His advisers worried it would appear that America had accepted Soviet dominance in the East. But Ford, like most of his generation, understood the deeper truth. The Cold War had reached a point where even symbolic cooperation was better than another decade of standoff. For ordinary people, détente offered a brief and precious quiet. The constant drumbeat of crises eased, the specter of nuclear war faded from nightly news, cultural exchanges blossomed, American orchestras toured Moscow, Soviet ballet troupes danced in New York. Books once banned crossed the Atlantic in both directions. Scientists collaborated on medicine, technology, and even space. The Apollo-Soyuz test project in 1975 became a symbol of what was possible: American and Soviet spacecraft docking gently in orbit, astronauts shaking hands in weightless embrace while millions watched below. For a fleeting instant, the sky that had divided them became a place of unity. Yet beneath the polite smiles and diplomatic toasts, the contradictions of détente ran deep. The Soviet Union, for all its talk of peace, remained a tightly controlled society. Its citizens could see the mentory says, and it face lies and a state visitation, west through smuggled books, pirated tapes, and foreign broadcasts, but they could not freely speak or travel. Dissidents like Andrei Sakharov and Alexander Solzhenitsyn began to speak out, demanding that the promises of Helsinki, those lofty words about human rights, be honored at home. The Kremlin responded with censorship, exile, and silence. Détente had opened a window, and now even the smallest breeze of truth was considered dangerous. In America, too, détente had its critics. The optimism of Nixon's diplomacy had curdled into skepticism after Watergate. The scandal had stripped away illusions of moral certainty. The public that once believed their nation always acted for good now questioned what had been done in their name. The coups, the wars, the secrets. Faith in government fell like autumn leaves, quietly but completely. And with that mistrust came a new question. If both superpowers were corrupt in their own ways, what did détente really mean? In 1976, a former peanut farmer from Georgia rose to prominence on a promise of honesty and decency. Jimmy Carter spoke softly, with the accent of the South and the conviction of a Sunday school teacher. He talked about human rights not as a slogan, but as a moral compass. To many Americans, tired of cynicism, it felt like light returning after a long storm. Carter believed that détente should be more than treaties and handshakes. It should reflect values. He saw the Cold War not as an inevitable duel, but as a contest for the soul of humanity. But the world Carter inherited was less idealistic than his vision. The Soviet Union under Brezhnev was slowing, ossifying under bureaucracy. The United States, though still dynamic, faced inflation, energy crises, and self-doubt. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 reminded Americans how vulnerable prosperity could be to distant events. Gas lines stretched for blocks, tempers flared at empty pumps. It was a different kind of fear now, not nuclear, but economic. The promise of post-war abundance had cracked. Détente, once seen as pragmatic stability, began to feel like stagnation. Still, the machinery of diplomacy rolled on. The strategic arms limitation talks SALT II, continued through the decade, seeking to cap not just the number of missiles, but their delivery systems. Negotiators spoke in the language of megatons and payloads, of verification and parity. The logic was cold and mathematical. If annihilation could be measured, it could perhaps be prevented. When Carter and Brezhnev met in Vienna in 1979 to sign the SALT II treaty, they smiled for the cameras, their faces framed by the ghosts of millions they hoped never to endanger. The symbolism was clear, even adversaries could talk. But talking was not the same as trusting. In the shadows, both sides continued to build. Each accused the other of cheating, of hiding missiles in forests and submarines. The race slowed, but it never stopped. Beneath the words of peace, the engines of rivalry still hummed. Elsewhere, the Cold War refused to obey the script of détente. In the Horn of Africa, war erupted between Ethiopia and Somalia, a conflict fueled by shifting alliances and Soviet arms. In southern Africa, Cuban troops fought alongside socialist movements in Angola, while South Africa, supported indirectly by Western interests, battled to suppress them. The pattern of proxy wars continued, proving that détente was a luxury reserved for the great powers, not the small nations caught between them. In Latin America, authoritarian regimes justified their brutality as part of the struggle against communism. From Argentina's dirty war to Chile's secret prisons, thousands of lives disappeared into the machinery of fear. Washington's silence spoke louder than its rhetoric. The human rights Carter championed became awkwardly selective, a principle invoked against Moscow but often ignored where American allies were concerned. The contradiction haunted his presidency. At home, Americans watched all this with a mix of confusion and fatigue. The country had endured assassinations, scandal, and inflation. Now, it seemed, history had slowed to a crawl. The great causes of earlier decades had given way to resignation. There were no parades for détente, no songs for compromise. The drama of confrontation had given way to the dull ache of coexistence. In the Soviet Union, life was equally subdued. Brezhnev's rule brought stability, but it was the stability of still water, smooth on the surface, stagnant underneath. The state promised security in exchange for conformity. Apartments were small, but guaranteed. Jobs were monotonous, but permanent. People learned to live within limits, to find humor in bureaucracy and beauty in scarcity. The joke among Muscovites was that, under Stalin, everything was forbidden. Under Khrushchev, everything was discussed. Under Brezhnev, nothing worked, but at least nothing exploded. Yet even within that quiet monotony, something was shifting. The generation that had grown up after World War II began to question why their world remained sealed off from the rest. Rock music leaked across borders on cassette tapes. Jeans, banned as symbols of Western decadence, became coveted treasures sold in back alleys. The Soviet youth learned English words from Beatles lyrics recorded on X-ray films, bone records, they called them. The Iron Curtain was still standing, but sound could pass through it. For older Americans, the 1,970 seconds felt oddly familiar echoes of the Great Depression's uncertainty mixed with the calm of post-war suburbia. They had watched the rise of television, the fall of Nixon, the moon landing, and now this quiet balancing act between giants. They had seen the world race toward destruction, and then pause, unsure whether to go forward or back. It was as if the Cold War itself had grown tired of shouting. And yet, in the winter of 1979, the silence broke once again. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. To the Kremlin, it was a defensive act, an attempt to stabilize a friendly government and prevent Islamic insurgents from spreading chaos near its borders. To Washington, it was proof that détente had been a mirage. Tanks rolling through the Hindu Kush looked like echoes of Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968, the old reflex of empire disguised as fraternal aid. Carter, deeply disillusioned, responded swiftly. He withdrew the SALT II treaty from Senate consideration, suspended grain exports, and called for a boycott of the upcoming 1980 Moscow Olympics. For the first time in years, the language of confrontation returned. The frost of the Cold War had crept back overnight. The invasion of Afghanistan was more than a political miscalculation. It was a symbol of exhaustion. The Soviet Union, straining under the weight of global commitments, had overreached. The war would drain its treasury, its morale, and its young men for a decade. It would become, as one historian later called it, the Soviet Vietnam. But in 1979, no one yet knew that. The world only knew that détente, that fragile hope born in the handshake of Nixon and Brezhnev, was over. That same year, revolution swept through Iran. The Shah, long supported by the United States as a pillar of stability, was overthrown by a wave of religious and populist fury. The American embassy in Tehran was stormed, and 52 diplomats were taken hostage. For 444 days, they remained prisoners, their plight broadcast nightly on television. It was humiliation compounded a superpower, paralyzed by a nation it had once considered an ally. For Americans of a certain age, it was a bitter déjà vu, the helplessness of the hostage crisis echoing the confusion of Vietnam. For Carter, it was the unraveling of his idealism. His calm resolve could not ease the pain of a nation that once again felt mocked by fate. Inflation, energy shortages, and international embarrassment conspired to erode faith in leadership. The world that had once seemed governed by reason now felt adrift. In the Soviet Union, Brezhnev's health declined, his speeches slurred, his hands trembled. Yet the bureaucracy carried on, an empire on autopilot. The propaganda still spoke of progress, but the reality was decay, factories outdated, harvests shrinking, citizens disillusioned. Behind the parade banners, the workers of Leningrad and Kiev whispered that perhaps the American model, for all its contradictions, offered something their own never could: choice. By the time the decade closed, détente lay in ruins. The word itself, once elegant, became almost ironic. The new decade would bring new leaders and new rhetoric, colder and louder than before. Yet for a brief moment in the 1970 seconds, the world had glimpsed what peace might have looked like, not the peace of victory, but of restraint. It was imperfect, tentative, and temporary. But it mattered because it proved that even enemies could grow weary of hatred. For those who lived through it, détente remains a memory tinged with both relief and regret. Relief that the missiles stayed silent. Regret that the chance for lasting calm slipped away so easily. Older Americans still remember the feeling of that era, the strange combination of safety and unease, of diplomacy and doubt. They remember turning the television dial from Apollo-Soyuz to Afghanistan and wondering when the world had quietly changed direction. History would later call the 1970 seconds a decade of decline, but in truth, it was a decade of introspection when nations looked inward and found uncertainty staring back. The Cold War had not ended. It had simply paused to catch its breath. And as the sun set on that weary decade, both superpowers stood facing the mirror, unsure whether they saw strength or exhaustion reflected there. Culture in the crossfire. 1970, 1985. When the noise of politics faded at night, another kind of Cold War continued, not fought with missiles or tanks, but with melodies, movies, ideas, and dreams. In the 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, culture itself became a battlefield and a bridge. The world's two great systems, capitalism and communism, competed not only for territory but for the imagination of humankind. In this quieter arena, the weapons were books, songs, blue jeans, and television screens. It was a war fought in hearts rather than headlines. For older Americans, this chapter of history felt almost personal. They had grown up during the Depression, come of age through World War II, and watched the Cold War harden into daily reality. Yet by the 1970 seconds, their grandchildren lived in a new world, one of color TVs, transistor radios, and international broadcasts. Information moved faster than ideology could contain it. And as the world grew smaller, the Great Divide began to blur around the edges. In the Soviet Union, the state still claimed to control every song, every film, every printed word. Official art was required to serve the collective. Painters filled canvases with bright workers and heroic farmers. Musicians composed symphonies of industry and progress. Yet, beneath this surface, an underground rhythm pulsed. Young people traded bootleg rock recordings pressed on discarded X-ray films, skeletons humming with forbidden sound. They gathered in smoky apartments, whispering lyrics that spoke of longing, not revolution. To them, the West was not a political system but a distant frequency on a short-wave dial, a place where the music sounded freer, the voices more alive. On the other side of the ocean, Western culture was learning to speak in global tones. American movies traveled further than diplomats could. John Wayne and James Bond projected confidence and glamour to audiences who had never seen a shopping mall or a Cadillac. Hollywood became an unofficial embassy of capitalism, offering stories in which individuality triumphed over conformity, where good men prevailed, and where every problem could be solved within 2 hours and a happy ending. In a world weary of manifestos, entertainment became persuasion. Even the smallest things carried meaning. A pair of Levi's jeans could start a small riot in Moscow. Western brands, Coca-Cola, Marlboro, Sony, were whispered about like contraband treasures. The simple act of wearing denim or listening to jazz was, in its own quiet way, an act of rebellion. Soviet youth who wore American clothing did not think of themselves as political. They were simply reaching for the texture of a world that seemed more spontaneous, more real. The authorities sensed the danger. They could ban a film or confiscate a record, but they could not unteach curiosity. In America, meanwhile, culture reflected its own contradictions. The country that championed freedom abroad wrestled with disillusionment at home. Vietnam, Watergate, and economic uncertainty had left their marks. The art of the 1,970 seconds turned introspective. Folk singers questioned authority, filmmakers explored moral ambiguity, authors wrote about alienation and loss. Yet even this honesty became part of America's soft power, proof that its society could doubt itself openly and survive. To citizens behind the Iron Curtain, that freedom to question was enviable. Television became the new global mirror. The 1,972 Summit Series in ice hockey between Canada and the Soviet Union drew millions of viewers on both sides, transforming a sport into a symbol of ideology. Each goal felt like a small victory for one system over the other. Yet when the players shook hands at the end, the applause seemed to belong not to the victors, but to the act of meeting itself. Sport, like art, offered glimpses of shared humanity amid rivalry. Nowhere was this clearer than at the Olympic Games. The 1,972 Munich Olympics began with hopes of unity and ended in tragedy when terrorists murdered Israeli athletes. The world watched in grief, realizing that even the purest arena could not escape the century's darkness. Yet 4 years later, in Montreal, and again in 1,980 inches Lake Placid, the Games became stages for Cold War theater. The miracle on ice, in 1980, when a group of American college players defeated the mighty Soviet team, sent shivers of pride across the United States. For many, it felt like redemption after years of doubt. For the Soviets, it was humiliation, though even they could not help admiring the joy that spilled from those young faces. Across the Atlantic, European artists and thinkers built bridges of their own. In divided Berlin, music clubs thumped on one side while silence reigned on the other. Western DJs beamed sounds across the wall. East German youth recorded them on cassettes and danced behind closed curtains. In Prague, poets like Václav Havel wrote plays that disguised political critique as absurdist humor. In Poland, the underground press, the samizdat, kept truth alive through mimeograph machines and whispered distribution. These small acts of creation were acts of courage. They proved that words could outlast walls. Meanwhile, technology was changing the rules of the game. Satellite television, photocopiers, and cassette tapes weakened censorship. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcast jazz, news, and sermons into the Eastern Bloc. The Soviets jammed the frequencies, but static could not erase curiosity. The very tools invented to manage communication were becoming tools of liberation. In the kitchens of Leningrad, families tuned their shortwave sets late at night, listening through the crackle for Sinatra, for baseball scores, for the voice of another world. Culture crossed in both directions. Soviet ballet, refined and disciplined, mesmerized Western audiences. The Bolshoi toured New York. Maya Plisetskaya became a legend. Their art carried no slogans, only grace. A reminder that behind ideology, there were human hands, human hearts. When the dancers bowed, applause drowned politics for a few precious moments. In literature, too, the exchange deepened. Translations of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Pasternak found eager readers in the West, while American writers like Steinbeck and Hemingway were read secretly in Moscow. Words became ambassadors, more enduring than treaties. A line of poetry could travel where an army could not. For the elderly who had lived through war and depression, these cultural crossings were both comforting and strange. They had been raised to see the Soviet Union as an enemy, yet here were Russian dancers, athletes, and composers admired across America. They turned on their radios and heard Tchaikovsky between commercials. It was confusing, yet quietly hopeful proof that even during enmity, beauty could still be shared. The late 1970 seconds brought a new kind of spectacle, one made of neon, rhythm, and speed. The global spread of rock and disco reached into places where political speeches never could. The Bee Gees played in Berlin, ABBA echoed from radios in Budapest. Even in the gray corridors of Soviet apartment blocks, teenagers danced in secret to the beat of Western pop. For all the talk of ideology, joy had its own underground network. But art could also sharpen resistance. In 1980, a Polish shipyard electrician named Lech Wałęsa led workers in strikes that birthed Solidarity, the first independent labor union in the communist world. Their anthem was not a manifesto but a song, simple, defiant, sung softly at first and then louder as courage spread. Music carried what pamphlets could not. Within a few years, those same chords would help shake an empire. In the United States, the cultural mood shifted again. The election of Ronald Reagan in 1980 brought back a confident narrative. Movies turned heroic once more. Patriotism returned to the screen. Top Gun and Rocky IV turned rivalry into entertainment, pitting individual daring against faceless bureaucracy. For an older generation, Reagan's optimism felt familiar, a return to the moral clarity of the 1940 seconds, when good and evil seemed easier to name. For younger audiences, it was thrilling, if simplified. Hollywood became both mirror and mythmaker, projecting strength even as the world's realities grew more complex. In Moscow, the response was defensive but uncertain. Censors tightened their grip, yet the flow of images could not be stopped. Even state-approved films began to reveal cracks, stories of small people trapped in big systems, of laughter amid grayness. By the early 1980 seconds, a quiet fatigue hung over Soviet art. The slogans no longer inspired, the realism no longer felt real. Behind every poster of a smiling worker, there was an unspoken question. How long could the facade hold? Science and culture intertwined too. The space race, once pure rivalry, had evolved into reluctant partnership. The shared mission of Apollo-Soyuz had shown that cooperation was possible. The continued exchange of data and experiments proved that curiosity could bridge ideology. In classrooms from California to Kiev, children drew rockets and dreamed not of war but of exploration. Perhaps, they thought, the next generation would live among stars instead of silos. Back on Earth, art continued to whisper what politics shouted. The painters of the Soviet underground, the so-called non-conformists, filled basements with abstract canvases, explosions of color defying the monotone of official art. In New York, the minimalist and pop art movements mirrored that defiance in reverse, turning consumer culture into commentary. Both East and West, in their own ways, were questioning what freedom actually meant. Sports remained the most visible theater of this cultural Cold War. When the United States boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics and the Soviets retaliated by skipping the 1984 Los Angeles Games, the athletes suffered most. Years of training ended in silence. Yet even in absence, gestures of peace appeared. During the 1984 Winter Games in Sarajevo, athletes from both blocs mingled freely, laughing, trading pins, showing that human fellowship could outlast politics. To viewers back home, those small images, a Soviet skater hugging an American rival, felt like windows into a better world. By the early 1980 seconds, the cultural war had produced its own paradox. The West had won hearts through abundance, but it was haunted by its own restlessness. The East had preserved order, but at the cost of spontaneity. Both sides looked across the divide and saw what they lacked. American families envied the sense of community they imagined in socialist societies. Soviet citizens envied the choices they saw in Western stores. Each dreamed of balance, of a world where strength did not require fear. Technology continued to dissolve the boundaries. Videotape recorders appeared. Satellite dishes sprouted quietly on balconies. What had once been forbidden could now be copied, replayed, and shared endlessly. A teenager in Moscow could watch Star Wars one night and hear a Beatles bootleg the next. In that mix of galaxies and guitars, the Cold War began to lose its grip on imagination. The story was changing, not because governments decreed it, but because people everywhere had begun to dream beyond ideology. For those listening today, especially those who lived through it, the cultural Cold War feels less like confrontation and more like memory. The smell of vinyl records, the glow of a cathode ray screen, the thrill of forbidden music. They remember the fear too, the sirens, the drills, the political speeches, but above all, they remember how ordinary life went on. They remember raising families, tending gardens, fixing cars, falling in love. History roared overhead, yet life continued beneath it, steady and human. By 1985, the contest of culture had done something neither side expected. It had softened the borders of the mind. The more each tried to outshine the other, the more they came to resemble one another. The West adopted welfare and social programs. The East experimented, cautiously, with consumer goods and pop music. Ideology had become lifestyle, and in that quiet transformation lay the seeds of what would come next, a moment when one side, weary of pretending, would finally decide to change. But for now, in those years between détente and reform, the world swayed to the rhythm of competing dreams, a planet humming with static, songs, and the persistent hope that someday the music itself might be enough. The Second Cold War, 1980, 1985. The night sky of the 1980 seconds glowed with artificial stars, satellites, bombers, and orbiting weapons that hummed silently above a nervous world. The Cold War, which had once seemed to be cooling under détente, found its second wind. It was no longer a war of slow diplomacy, but of renewed confrontation, a second Cold War, as some would call it, when words grew sharp again, budgets swelled, and fear, that old companion of the atomic age, returned to whisper at the edges of sleep. For the men and women who had already lived through Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam, it felt like déjà vu, the old tensions waking up after a brief and restless nap. Yet this new phase was different. The battle was no longer about who could conquer, it was about who could endure. The world had grown too small, too interdependent for open war. So the struggle moved into new territories: technology, economics, and the fragile theater of perception. When Ronald Reagan took the oath of office in January 1981, a cold wind swept across Washington. To many Americans, his voice was a balm, confident, familiar, almost cinematic. He spoke not as a strategist, but as a storyteller, promising to restore pride after years of inflation, hostages, and doubt. "We will again be the shining city on a hill," he said, echoing old Puritan dreams. But in Moscow, That same voice sounded like the return of an old adversary who had learned to smile while drawing his sword. Reagan believed the Cold War could be won, not merely managed. He saw the Soviet Union not as a partner to negotiate with, but as what he famously called an evil empire. It was language the world had not heard in years, simple and absolute, like the films he once starred in. He increased military spending to levels unseen since the 1962, ordering new bombers, missiles, and a modernized nuclear triad. The Pentagon buzzed with projects that gleamed with futuristic ambition: stealth aircraft, precision weapons, and the most controversial of all, a system to defend the United States from nuclear missiles, a shield in the heavens dubbed the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. The media, half in awe and half in fear, called it Star Wars. The idea seemed to belong as much to imagination as to science: satellites armed with lasers that could shoot down incoming missiles before they struck. Scientists doubted it could work. Politicians debated its cost. The Soviets saw it as a direct challenge to the fragile balance of terror that had kept the peace. For decades, the logic of deterrence had rested on mutual vulnerability, the grim certainty that neither side could strike without being destroyed in return. Now, Reagan spoke of escape from that logic, of safety through superiority. In the Kremlin's eyes, this was not defense, it was provocation. Inside the Soviet Union, the reaction was both alarmed and bewildered. The aging leadership, a line of tired men shaped by Stalin's shadow, viewed Reagan's rhetoric with suspicion and disbelief. Leonid Brezhnev, old and ailing, had outlived détente, but not his own bureaucracy. When he died in 1982, the throne of Soviet power passed quickly from one fading figure to another. First, Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, sharp but sickly, and then Konstantin Chernenko, whose frailty made him little more than a caretaker. It was as if the empire itself had grown old, sustained by inertia rather than conviction. The Soviet people joked darkly that the Politburo now ruled from the hospital. And yet, for all its stagnation, the Soviet machine still commanded immense power. Its missiles, submarines, and tanks remained formidable. Its influence stretched across continents. In Central America, Soviet weapons flowed to Nicaragua's Sandinista government, while the United States funded the Contras, their opponents. In Afghanistan, the war dragged into its fifth and sixth years, Soviet troops trudging through endless mountains, fighting an enemy that vanished like mist. The cost was enormous. For every victory claimed in propaganda, another coffin returned to Moscow unacknowledged. Mothers whispered prayers in kitchens, and soldiers wrote letters home that never reached print. Afghanistan became the war that the Soviet Union could neither win nor leave. Meanwhile, in America, the economy began to recover. Inflation fell, confidence returned. Reagan's optimism, his faith in American destiny, found fertile ground among citizens weary of doubt. His speeches were carefully crafted symphonies of reassurance, full of imagery, hope, and nostalgia. He spoke of freedom not as an abstraction, but as a living thing, like sunlight breaking through clouds. For older Americans, especially those who had come of age during the Second World War, his words rekindled something long dormant, the belief that their nation still had purpose, that history could be steered by conviction rather than compromise. But beneath that warmth, the temperature of the world was dropping again. In Europe, the 1,980 seconds began with fear. The Soviets deployed SS-20 nuclear missiles, capable of striking Western capitals within minutes. The NATO alliance, under American guidance, responded by placing Pershing II and cruise missiles on European soil. It was a deadly mirror dance, move for move, rocket for rocket. Ordinary citizens across the continent took to the streets in protest. In Bonn, London, and Rome, hundreds of thousands marched carrying banners that read, "No more missiles." Parents explained to their children what nuclear winter meant. Artists painted peace doves beside shelters stocked with canned food. In Moscow, the propaganda machine roared to life. The United States, it claimed, sought world domination. Its missiles were daggers aimed at the heart of socialism. Films portrayed Americans as reckless cowboys, armed with nuclear toys. Yet in private, Soviet generals worried that their own arsenal was aging, their technology lagging. The great competition of the 1,980 seconds was not just military, it was economic. The United States could afford its arms race. The Soviet Union could not. Its factories were outdated, its agriculture inefficient. The price of oil, one of its few lifelines, fluctuated painfully. While Reagan's America spent confidently, Brezhnev's heirs quietly borrowed time. And still, the rhetoric escalated. In 1983, a tragic accident nearly shattered the fragile calm. Korean Airlines Flight 007, a civilian passenger jet, strayed off course into Soviet airspace. Mistaken for a spy plane, it was shot down by a Soviet fighter, killing all 269 people aboard, including an American congressman. The world gasped. Reagan called it an act of barbarism, his voice breaking as he addressed the nation. In the Soviet Union, officials stumbled through denials, then half-admissions. The tragedy exposed the era's madness that a few moments of confusion could erase hundreds of lives and bring superpowers to the brink once more. That same autumn, NATO conducted a routine military exercise called Able Archer 83, a simulation of nuclear release procedures. To Western planners, it was business as usual. To the Soviet Union, already on edge, it looked terrifyingly real. In underground bunkers, Soviet officers debated whether a first strike might be imminent. For several tense days, the world came closer to accidental war than most ever knew. Only later, when archives opened, would the truth emerge that one misread radar blip, one nervous order, could have ended civilization. And yet, by some mixture of luck and human hesitation, disaster never came. The world continued to spin, unaware of how narrowly it had escaped silence. As these global tempests raged, the Cold War also returned home in subtler forms. In the United States, films like The Day After dramatized nuclear apocalypse, haunting millions who watched in uneasy quiet. Children still practiced duck and cover drills, though most understood the futility. Yet amid the anxiety, there was also a strange fascination, a sense that the Cold War had become part of everyday culture. Spy novels topped bestseller lists, video games imagined battles in pixelated form. Fear had become routine, almost familiar. And in the East, beneath layers of censorship, discontent simmered. Soviet citizens who tuned in to Western broadcasts began to sense how far their nation had drifted from its early promises. The slogans about equality rang hollow beside empty stores. The myth of progress collapsed under the weight of daily shortages and endless bureaucracy. The empire still looked mighty from afar, but inside, it was quietly hollowing out. Still, there were moments of human warmth, even in those frozen years. American and Soviet scientists continued limited cooperation on space and medicine. The people-to-people programs, once born of détente, persisted in small ways, exchanges of teachers, journalists, and cultural troops. These small encounters, though rarely reported, became seeds of understanding. A Russian violinist performing in Chicago, an American doctor visiting Moscow, they carried home not propaganda, but impressions, smiles, shared, fatigue, mutual curiosity. In an age of missiles, such gestures were fragile threads of peace. The Cold War's second wind was not without irony. While leaders thundered, ordinary people on both sides longed for quiet. Americans had grown weary of perpetual vigilance. Soviets yearned for relief from austerity. The world's greatest confrontation was being sustained not by passion but by momentum, a machine that no one quite knew how to stop. Then, in 1984, as Reagan won re-election with promises of renewed strength, a new figure emerged in Moscow's corridors of power, a younger man with sharp eyes and restless energy, Mikhail Gorbachev. Few in the West noticed him at first. He was in his early 50s, unusually young for the Soviet hierarchy, with a red birthmark on his forehead and a reputation for intelligence and candor. His rise through the agricultural sector had taught him something the old guard had forgotten, that people's patience was not infinite, that systems could rust from within. By the time Chernenko died in early 1985, the Soviet Union was exhausted. Its leadership had buried 3 general secretaries in as many years. Its soldiers were still dying in Afghanistan. Its factories were still failing to meet quotas. The air in Moscow felt heavy with resignation. Then came the announcement. Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Few realized, as they watched him step onto the Kremlin stage, that they were witnessing the beginning of the end, not only of stagnation, but of the Cold War itself. For Reagan, now in his second term, the emergence of a younger, more articulate Soviet leader posed both opportunity and risk. Was this man another mask for the same old system, or was he truly different? The answer would take time and much patience to discover. But for the moment, the world exhaled just a little. The sight of vigor returning to the Kremlin hinted that perhaps the cycle of fear could yet be broken. By 1985, the Cold War had come full circle. It had begun in rubble and rivalry, and now it stood at the edge of exhaustion. The arsenals were vast, the ideologies brittle, and the people, the ordinary people of every nation, simply wanted to live their lives without the constant shadow of annihilation. The Second Cold War had proven something both frightening and profound, that even peace can be fragile when pride is at stake. Yet within that fragility lay the first spark of change. In the cautious reforms Gorbachev would soon propose, in Reagan's unexpected willingness to meet him halfway, the long frost began imperceptibly to thaw. The decade was turning once more, and with it, the story of an entire century. The age of Gorbachev, perestroika, and the end of an empire, 1985, 1989. When Mikhail Gorbachev took the helm of the Soviet Union in March 1985, the world barely stirred. The newspapers mentioned him as another in a line of gray men, another bureaucrat with cautious words and careful promises. But inside the Kremlin's echoing halls, something was different. He walked faster, he smiled, he spoke without reading every word from paper. His wife, Raisa, elegant and outspoken, appeared beside him in public, unheard of for Soviet leaders. The frost that had settled over Moscow for decades seemed to lift slightly, as though spring sunlight had found a crack in the clouds. The Soviet Union he inherited, however, was decaying beneath its solemn grandeur. The state still projected strength, parades of tanks on Red Square, space launches, and the heavy certainty of power, but the system groaned under its own weight. Factories produced tractors no one needed, shelves stood empty of soap, and citizens waited in endless queues for bread. In the countryside, farmers hoarded potatoes because the state paid too little for their crops. The Soviet dream had ossified into routine. Its ideology had become ritual. Gorbachev, only 54, was young enough to remember enthusiasm and old enough to know what was being lost. He began to speak of renewal. The word he chose would echo through history, perestroika, literally restructuring. At first it sounded like yet another slogan, one more banner fluttering above the bureaucracy. But Gorbachev meant something deeper. He wanted to breathe life into the stagnant heart of socialism, to reform the economy, to ease the grip of the party, to give ordinary citizens a voice again. And with perestroika came another word, glasnost, openness. It meant that people could speak more freely, question the past, and even criticize mistakes. In a nation where silence had once been survival, the very idea was revolutionary. At first, the changes were cautious. Newspapers published mild critiques of inefficiency. Artists were allowed to paint abstractly again. Books long banned, Dr. Zhivago, Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, returned to the shelves. Citizens gathered in small groups to discuss history that had once been forbidden. It was as if the Soviet people, after decades of whispering, were finally learning to speak in their normal voices again. There was nervous laughter in the air. a sense that something was happening that even the leaders could not entirely control. In Washington, President Reagan watched these developments with careful interest. His advisors warned that Gorbachev might simply be repackaging the old Soviet system in softer words. But Reagan, ever the optimist, sensed something genuine. "We can do business together," he said privately after their first encounter. It was a remarkable shift from the man who had once called the USSR an evil empire. Perhaps it was age, perhaps experience, or perhaps he saw in Gorbachev the same hunger for an ending that he himself carried, the longing to finish this long chapter of tension that had stretched across half a century. The first real sign of change came in Geneva in late 1985. Reagan and Gorbachev met face-to-face for the first time, two men representing entire civilizations, sitting across a small table by a fire. The world watched their smiles, the warmth in their gestures, the almost old-fashioned civility of it. They spoke not of victory, but of survival, of the insanity of building enough weapons to destroy the planet several times over. When they stepped outside together, the cameras caught them laughing. For the first time in decades, the superpowers looked human again. In the months that followed, the rhythm of diplomacy quickened. There were summits in Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow, each a small step toward thawing the ice. At Reykjavik, in 1986, the two men came astonishingly close to agreeing to eliminate all nuclear weapons entirely. The talks collapsed at the last moment over Reagan's refusal to abandon his strategic defense initiative, but the world glimpsed something almost miraculous, the possibility that the arms race could be reversed not by fear, but by choice. That same year, tragedy struck the Soviet Union from within. On the night of the 26th of April 1986, in a place called Chernobyl, a nuclear reactor exploded. The fire burned for days, sending clouds of radioactive dust across Europe. At first, officials tried to hide it. The old reflexes of secrecy kicked in, but the truth could not be contained. Swedish monitoring stations detected radiation, and soon the world knew. The disaster exposed everything Gorbachev was fighting against: the corruption, the lies, the bureaucratic paralysis. For many, Chernobyl was more than a catastrophe. It was a revelation. The Soviet Union could no longer pretend to perfection. Glasnost was no longer optional, it was survival. Gorbachev pressed forward. He loosened state control over factories, allowed cooperatives and small private businesses to open, and encouraged debate in the media. In the parliament, once a rubber stamp for party decrees, genuine arguments broke out, real voices raised in disagreement. Across the Eastern Bloc, other nations watched closely. In Poland, the independent Union solidarity, once crushed, re-emerged stronger than ever. In Hungary and Czechoslovakia, reformers began to whisper that if Moscow could change, so could they. For the first time since Stalin, the satellite states looked toward the Kremlin not in fear, but in curiosity. Yet within the Soviet system, resistance hardened. The old guard of the Communist Party accused Gorbachev of undermining socialism. The military worried about weakening defense. Workers, long used to guaranteed jobs and prices, grew anxious as reforms disrupted their routines. The economy, already fragile, wobbled under the shock of transition. Inflation rose, shortages deepened. People grumbled that glasnost gave them more freedom to complain but not enough bread to buy. Gorbachev, walking a tightrope between old and new, found himself besieged from both sides. Still, he pressed on, driven by conviction that change was irreversible once begun. Reagan and Gorbachev met again in Washington in 1987, and this time they succeeded. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF Treaty, was signed, the first agreement in history to actually eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. Missiles that had cast long shadows over Europe were dismantled and destroyed under mutual supervision. For millions who had lived for decades under the threat of annihilation, it was as if a weight had been quietly lifted from the heart of the world. When Gorbachev visited Washington, he was greeted not as an enemy but as a celebrity. Crowds lined the streets, cheering the Soviet leader whose warmth and humor seemed to bridge the chasm of ideology. The world was changing faster than anyone could comprehend. On television screens, the Soviet Union began to look less like a fortress and more like a country of real people. Laughing, struggling, arguing, dreaming, Western journalists were allowed unprecedented access. Films once banned Battleship Potemkin, Andrei Rublev, The Cranes Are Flying were re-released in theaters. Rock bands toured Moscow. American fast food appeared in Red Square. The Iron Curtain, long and unbroken wall, began to develop holes not from explosives, but from curiosity. By 1988, even the Soviet satellite states sensed the tremors. Gorbachev announced what became known as the Sinatra Doctrine, that each nation of the Eastern Bloc could do it their way. It was a quiet renunciation of the Brezhnev Doctrine, which had justified the invasions of Hungary and Czechoslovakia decades earlier. Now Moscow declared it would no longer intervene militarily to keep communism in place. The words seemed simple, but their impact was seismic. For 40 years, Eastern Europe had lived under the certainty that Soviet tanks would roll if anyone strayed from orthodoxy. Now, for the first time, that certainty was gone. In Poland, elections were held free ones, truly free, and solidarity won. In Hungary, border fences were quietly cut open. In East Germany, citizens began to talk about traveling to the West without permission. And in Moscow, Gorbachev did not send troops. He kept his promise. The empire, once held together by fear, was loosening by choice. But not everyone saw this as triumph. At home, Gorbachev's reforms unleashed forces he could not control. The republics of the Soviet Union, Ukraine, the Baltics, Georgia, Armenia began to rediscover their own voices, their own histories. Nationalism, long suppressed, returned like a forgotten melody. People demanded autonomy and sometimes independence outright. Gorbachev hoped to create a renewed federation, a more humane socialism. But the tide of freedom, once released, does not turn easily. In 1988, Reagan traveled to Moscow for their final summit. The symbolism was profound. The once unthinkable image of an American president strolling through Red Square, chatting amiably with citizens. A young Soviet journalist asked him, "Do you still think this is the evil empire?" Reagan smiled and shook his head. "No," he said softly, "that was another time." For millions watching on both sides of the world, it was a benediction, a quiet farewell to an era of fear. The Cold War, though not yet officially over, was already dissolving in spirit. The following year would prove decisive. 1989 began like any other. Parades in Moscow, ceremonies in Berlin, the dull rhythm of routine. But beneath that surface, the ground was shifting. In Poland, the new government took office. In Hungary, barbed wire along the Austrian border was removed. Thousands of East Germans crossed through, not with weapons but with luggage and smiles. The flood could not be stopped. And then, one night in November, it happened. The Berlin Wall, that gray scar across Europe, the symbol of everything the Cold War had stood for, was breached. It was not an invasion or a revolt, just confusion at first. A bureaucratic slip. A local East German official announced that travel restrictions were lifted, effective immediately. Crowds gathered at the checkpoints, unsure. The guards, uncertain what to do, stepped aside. People began to climb. They swung hammers. They sang. They embraced strangers from the other side. The world watched live as concrete fell and laughter filled the night air. East met West, and for once, there were no slogans, no speeches, only tears and applause. In Moscow, Gorbachev watched the images with a complex mix of pride and dread. He knew what it meant: the end, not just of the wall, but of an entire order. The Soviet Empire was unraveling peacefully, astonishingly, under his watch. He had not ordered it, but neither would he stop it. The age of coercion was over. "We could have stopped it," he would later say, "but that would have meant blood." And so, for the first time in Russian history, power yielded without massacre. For the world, it felt like dawn after a long winter. In America, bells rang. In Europe, champagne corks popped. But in the Soviet Union, celebration was tempered by uncertainty. Factories still stood idle, prices soared, and old promises dissolved faster than new ones could form. Yet amid the hardship, there was an undeniable exhilaration, a sense that history, once frozen, was alive again. By the end of 1989, communist governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania had all collapsed. The Warsaw Pact still existed on paper, but its heart had stopped beating. The world map, unchanged for 4 decades, was redrawn before everyone's eyes, not with war, but with will. And at the center of it all stood Mikhail Gorbachev, the reluctant revolutionary, the man who sought to save socialism and ended up liberating half the planet. He did not foresee the speed of what he had unleashed. Nor did he imagine that within 2 more years, even the Soviet Union itself would vanish. But for that brief, breathtaking window between 1985 and 1989, the impossible happened. The greatest confrontation in human history began to end, not with a bang, but with understanding. And for the millions who had lived half their lives under the shadow of war, that was miracle enough. The long twilight, from Cold War to Cold Peace, 1989, 1991, and beyond. When the Berlin Wall fell, it seemed as if the 20th century itself exhaled. For decades, the world had lived beneath that gray slab of concrete, the symbol of division, suspicion, and fear. And then, in a single night, ordinary people with hammers and bare hands undid what armies and statesmen could not. It was noisy, chaotic, joyful, but the joy carried an undertone of disbelief. Could it really be over? Could an age so vast, so defining, end with laughter and dust instead of bombs? In the months that followed, the map of Europe redrew itself almost daily. Borders softened, flags changed, parliaments rose in places that had known only party headquarters. In Prague, crowds filled Wenceslas Square, carrying candles, not rifles. In Poland, Lech Wałęsa raised his hand in the parliament that had once condemned him. In Hungary, fences along the Austrian border were cut apart and sold as souvenirs. The world watched these revolutions with awe, waiting for the inevitable crackdown, and it never came. The tanks stayed in their garages. The Red Army watched, uncertain, while history quietly rewrote its own script. In Moscow, Mikhail Gorbachev found himself both celebrated and cornered. Abroad, he was hailed as the man who ended the Cold War. At home, he was blamed for letting an empire dissolve. The Soviet economy, already fragile, teetered near collapse. Stores were empty. Queues stretched for bread and sugar. Inflation devoured savings. Glasnost had freed the truth, but it could not fill stomachs. Each republic of the Soviet Union, from the Baltic states to Georgia to Ukraine, began to speak openly of independence. National flags, long banned, reappeared on city squares like flowers in thawing soil. The songs once whispered in kitchens were now sung on public stages. Gorbachev tried to hold it together, proposing a looser federation, a union of sovereign states. But the tide was too strong. The old men of the Communist Party watched in panic as the world they had ruled for 70 years disintegrated around them. In August 1991, hardliners staged a coup, sending tanks into the streets of Moscow. They declared that Gorbachev was unfit, that order must be restored. For 3 tense days, the fate of the Soviet Union hung in the balance. But the people had changed. They no longer feared authority in the same way. Crowds surrounded the tanks, shouting, singing, offering flowers. And then a new figure stepped forward. Boris Yeltsin, the elected president of the Russian Republic, climbing onto a tank in front of the parliament building, defying the coup plotters. His courage electrified the crowd. Soldiers, uncertain whom to obey, lowered their guns. The coup collapsed within days, its leaders arrested, humiliated, their authority evaporated in the glare of television cameras. In that moment, the Soviet Union's story ended not with a civil war, but with refusal. By December 1991, the great experiment that had begun in the fires of revolution 74 years earlier quietly ceased to exist. One by one, the Soviet republics declared independence. The hammer and sickle flag, red and defiant, was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time on Christmas Day. In its place rose the tricolor of Russia, white, blue, and red. On that cold evening, Gorbachev addressed his people for the final time. His voice, calm but tired, carried the weight of history. We are living in a new world. The Cold War has ended, and the arms race has stopped. And then he stepped down, a man who had dismantled an empire without firing a shot. Across the ocean, in Washington, President George H.W. Bush watched the broadcast and quietly noted in his diary, "The Cold War is over." There were no parades, no victory banners. The United States had not conquered the Soviet Union, it had simply outlasted it. The competition that had shaped nearly every decision since 1947 had dissolved into the quiet strangeness of peace. For Americans who had grown up practicing atomic drills, who had measured their lives by crises, Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the sudden absence of an enemy felt almost unreal. The world had been divided for so long that unity seemed dreamlike. In Eastern Europe, the euphoria of liberation gave way to uncertainty. Capitalism arrived like a whirlwind, bringing freedom, yes, but also inequality, confusion, and the shock of change. In Moscow, grandmothers sold family heirlooms on street corners, factories closed, mafias rose. The dream of democracy was real, but fragile. Yet beneath the hardship, there was still a sense of pride, the pride of people who had faced down fear and chosen their own path at last. In the United States, the 1,990 seconds dawned with optimism. The peace dividend promised prosperity and technological wonder. The Berlin Wall's fragments were sold as souvenirs, paperweights, tiny relics of a giant age. American astronauts shook hands with Russian cosmonauts in orbit. The children of former adversaries played together in space. For a brief and luminous moment, it seemed that humankind had finally learned something from its century of struggle. But history, as always, is never simple. The Cold War had not merely divided the world, it had defined it. Its rivalries had structured politics, industry, even art. With the rivalry gone, so too vanished a certain clarity. The world entered what some called a unipolar moment, with the United States standing alone as the superpower. Others called it the end of history. Yet the very forces unleashed by the Cold War, nationalism, technology, ideology, did not vanish. They merely changed shape. The twilight that followed was not pure light, but the soft gray between eras. Still, something had shifted in the soul of the planet. For the first time in modern memory, humanity had pulled back from the brink. The nuclear arsenals were reduced, soldiers returned home, walls became memorials instead of fortresses. The Iron Curtain that had once divided families now existed only in museums and memory. In Berlin, the wall's remnants were painted with flowers and peace signs. Lovers kissed where guards once patrolled. Across the world, children born in 1991 grew up without ever hearing the phrase mutually assured destruction. To their grandparents, it felt like a kind of miracle. For older Americans, those who had lived through every stage of the Cold War, the ending brought reflection rather than triumph. They remembered the fear of the 1,950 seconds, the hope of the 1,960 seconds, the exhaustion of the 1,970 seconds, the brinkmanship of the 1,980 seconds. They remembered black and white televisions showing missile parades in Red Square and classroom drills where children hid beneath wooden desks. They remembered Kennedy's calm during Cuba, Nixon's handshake in China, Reagan's voice on a winter night saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." And they remembered, most of all, that it ended not with war, but with words. The Cold War had lasted 44 years, nearly half a century, in which the world balanced between annihilation and restraint. It had shaped not only nations, but human imagination. It gave us the internet, the space age, nuclear medicine, and global communication. It also left behind scars in Korea, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in the silent cemeteries of ideological experiments. It was a conflict fought in shadows, yet its echoes can still be heard in the headlines of today. In new rivalries, in the lingering mistrust between East and West, in the delicate hope that peace might still be possible. And yet, if there is one lesson the Cold War offers, it is this: that fear can be overcome by dialogue and power by patience. Two superpowers armed to destroy the world managed, through all their madness and pride, not to do so. For all the threats and posturing, reason fragile, human, imperfect, prevailed. It was the triumph not of ideology, but of endurance. As the 20th century ended, the long twilight of the Cold War faded into memory. The satellites still orbited, the submarines still patrolled, but the hands that guided them grew gentler. Former enemies became uneasy partners. The children of rival generals became exchange students, tourists, and friends. The great ideological struggle gave way to smaller, quieter ones, over markets, technology, and meaning. The future no longer seemed apocalyptic, only uncertain. And maybe that was enough. Today, when one stands before the fragments of the Berlin Wall, they seem smaller than expected, just slabs of concrete covered in graffiti and rain stains. Tourists touch them, take pictures, move on. But for those who lived through the long tension, those stones hold a different weight. They remember a time when every decision, every headline, carried the shadow of annihilation, and a time when, despite it all, humanity found a way to step back. The wall is not just a relic of division. It is a monument to restraint. As night falls on the memory of the Cold War, one truth remains clear. It was not a war that anyone won. It was a storm the world survived. The United States and the Soviet Union, for all their blunders and pride, proved something extraordinary, that even rival civilizations can learn to coexist without destroying each other. In the end, it was not missiles or armies that brought peace, but exhaustion, courage, and the quiet realization that no ideology is worth the end of the world. And so, in the hush that follows, the world turns gently on its axis, older and perhaps a little wiser. The guns are silent. The towers of Berlin cast their long evening shadows across a united city. The children of those who once stood on opposite sides now play in the same parks, under the same sky. The Cold War is gone, but its echoes remain in every hope for dialogue, in every treaty signed, in every fear of what might return if we forget. It was, in the end, not just a contest between nations, but a test of the human spirit, and against all odds, the spirit endured. So as this long story settles into the quiet of history, we can close our eyes and breathe easier, knowing that for all its darkness, the 20th century gave us one final, precious gift: the proof that peace, however fragile, is possible when humanity chooses to listen